Hello everyone, thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, you might as well listen to this story, and maybe you will fall asleep soon. Before listening, please like and subscribe first. Of course, the premise is that you really like my content. If you have any thoughts or feelings, please leave a message below. Your opinions will really help me grow. Okay, enough chit-chat. Let's get started. At 3:17 in the morning, Jane Elliott was clutching a signed copy of A Game of Shadows when her phone vibrated on her nightstand. The 7 pen-written words "To the Hunters of Tooth" on the title page were rubbed until they shone. They were written by Javier Romero himself at the book fair 3 years ago. The phone screen lit up, displaying Major Crime Unit Sanchez. Jane's finger paused on the answer button for 2 seconds. Sanchez rarely contacted her, except in emergencies, and she had only been transferred to the Major Crime Unit for 3 months. Romero's dead. Sanchez's voice sounded like sandpaper scraping across the microphone. Old Town Mansion, live. You better see it for yourself. Jane's breathing hitched for a moment. When she picked up the police badge and pinned it on the collar of her shirt, the metal buckle cut her fingertips, and blood drops fell on the word "Truth" in the autograph booklet, like a withered flower. The gravel roads in the old city were shining after the night rain. Jane stood in front of the wrought iron gate. The house number 13 looked cold under the red light of the police lights. She took out the autograph book. The handwriting on the title page was warmed by her body temperature. She found it at the bottom of the drawer when she gave up her job as a community police officer. She kept it under the desk lamp when she stayed up late to look at scene photos and learn trace detection knowledge. She cried with it on her chest after she independently solved the first serial theft case. Detective Elliott, the young police officer, lifted the cordon. The study is on the left side of the 2nd floor. The wooden stairs creaked. The moment Jane pushed open the door, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Javier Romero sat in a walnut desk chair, a thin wire wrapped around his neck, his chin slightly lowered, and his left hand tightly grasped a metal rose. The red wine glass at his feet broke into several pieces, and the dark red liquid spread across the floor, soaking the spread-out manuscript. The title of the first chapter of Bloody Finale, The Death of Silver Rose, was stained dark brown. There was a muddy boot print on the windowsill, and the diamond-shaped pattern on the heel was dazzlingly clear. Time of death. Jane's voice was tense. Pedro, the forensic doctor, straightened up, holding the thermometer between tweezers. 1:15 in the morning. Error no more than 5 minutes. He pointed to the manuscript. It says here, "When the midnight clock strikes 13, the silver rose will wither in the moonlight. The midnight clock of the Madrid church strikes 13, and the last one is 1.5 minutes. Jane dug her nails into her palms. She had seen a copy of Javier's manuscript. In the first chapter, the wire around the victim's neck was made of silver. The murderer wore lambskin gloves and used a master key technique to open the lock. But at this moment, she squatted down, and the metal rose glowed dark yellow under the evidence light. This is copper." She looked up. Silver and copper have different densities and weights. Javier couldn't have written the wrong material. Pedro nodded. "We've tested the wire. It's ordinary steel wire, which doesn't match the silver wire in the manuscript. Also," he held up the evidence bag, "there's half a fingerprint on the edge of the mud print on the windowsill. Leather gloves can't leave this." Jane's eyes flicked over the door lock. There were no signs of prying on the lock, and the spare key was hanging on the hook behind the door. But Javier's sister Clara mentioned last week that the spare key to the study disappeared 3 months ago. System startup. Jane took out the black tablet from her waist. This was the new tool that Sanchez had urgently given her this morning. Clue collection system. Want to try it? Photos of muddy boot prints, fingerprint scans, and metal composition reports were taken in turn. Blue light mist flowed on the tablet, and 3 red dots suddenly exploded. The composition of the copper rose matched the relics of the victim of the copper jewelry theft case in 2018. The half-fingerprint comparison library showed severed finger. The muddy boot print soil contained special clay from the abandoned factory on the east side of the old city, and that was where Lucio de la Cruz worked odd jobs after being released from prison. Lucio. Jane repeated the name in a low voice. Javier mentioned in the interview record that this man who was imprisoned for intentional injury was the prototype of the serial killer Dark Knight Rose in Bloody Final Chapter. The tablet suddenly vibrated. Jane picked up the phone and heard a woman's breath coming from the other end. "I'm Eileen Fisher, Javier's editor." Jane's temples were throbbing. Irene had the full manuscript of Blood Finale. Javier once said in an interview that she understands the story better than I do. "I received an encrypted email from him at 1 in the morning. Irene's voice trembled. "He said, someone wants to stop it from being published, and the attachment was a confirmation letter for the completion of the first chapter. But," she paused for 2 seconds, "he said yesterday afternoon that he wanted to revise the first chapter 3 more times." Jane's finger hovered over the pause button on her tablet. The rain outside the window suddenly got heavier, and hitting the glass sounded like someone knocking. She looked at Javier's hand clenching the copper rose, his knuckles turning bluish-white, as if he was trying to squeeze the metal into the bone. "Is Irene?" Jane's voice was colder than the sound of rain. "Do you have the latest manuscript revision log?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Jane heard the rustle of papers, and then Irene's muffled breathing. "Yes. I'll be at the publishing house at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." Jane hung up the phone, and the blue light from the tablet made the corners of her eyes red. The grandfather clock in Javier's study began to chime, and at the sound of 4 in the morning, she saw the last line of the manuscript soaked in red wine. "The silver rose has not yet bloomed. The bronze rose has arrived." A shadow flashed in the rain outside the window. When Jane grabbed the flashlight and rushed out, she only saw half a shoe print with diamond-shaped patterns in the mud in the corner of the yard. When Jane's black car stopped downstairs of the publishing house, the clock had just passed 10 o'clock. The rain hadn't stopped yet, and the wipers swept back and forth, leaving 2 blurry arcs. Eileen Fisher opened the door. A silver pen was pinned to the collar of her light gray suit, forming a stark contrast with the dark blue under her eyes. "Here's the change log." She pushed the USB drive across the oak table, and the metallic sound was like a pinprick. Simply insert the USB drive and the document will pop up on the screen. The latest modification time was at 2:17 a.m., 3 days ago, and the title bar reads Bloody Finale Chapter 1, Death of Silver Rose, Final Edition. As she scrolled down, her fingers suddenly stopped. In the newly added psychological profile section, the keywords abnormal obsession with copper objects and collecting victims' personal belongings to melt into souvenirs when committing crimes at night completely overlapped with the red pen annotations on the margins of the files of the 3 unsolved serial disappearance cases. Javier interviewed Lucio 3 times. Irene suddenly spoke, her voice like crumpled paper. The first time was in prison, and the next 2 times were in the rental house after he was released from prison. She pointed to the note at the end of the document. "This is what he said last time when he was drunk. He said that Lucio's eyes were like black grapes soaked in poison." Jane's back teeth felt sore from biting her teeth. She closed her computer and knocked over Irene's mug when she stood up. The dark brown liquid spread on the beige carpet, just like the pool of red wine that soaked the manuscript in Javier's study. The second stop was Javier's apartment. The technical team had cracked his private mailbox, and Jane stared at the unsent email on the screen, the recipient of which was Mark Hammond. "Dear Mr. Plagiarist, when your readers find that the 3rd chapter of Echoes in the Alley has a 97% overlap with my unpublished manuscript in 2015, will they think that your muse is actually a photocopier?" Jane read aloud, with a trembling tone at the end. The last sentence in the email made her heart skip a beat. "Don't worry, my new book will introduce this muse to you." She circled Mark's name 3 times with a red pen and posted it on the whiteboard. The arrogant corners of the man's mouth in the photo suddenly became glaring. There was a cold fragrance in Clara's gallery. Only when Jeanne showed her a copy of the will did the woman put down the bronze sculpture in her hand. He donated all the copyrights to the Literature Foundation. Clara dug her nails into her palms. "My mother gave it to him before she died, saying, 'This is the last bit of dignity for our Vega family.'" She suddenly laughed. "Last Tuesday at 10 o'clock he yelled in the study, 'You don't understand what the dignity of a writer is.' When I slammed the door, I knocked over his red wine glass, in the same place as the puddle at the scene." Jane's tablet vibrated in her pocket. Back in the police station's analysis room, in the blue light fog, the portraits of Lucio, Mark, and Clara were strung together into a net by countless red lines. The system prompt sounded, and a new message popped up in Lucio's notes column. June 15th, 2023. Javier's interview record. Lucio said he wanted to see the writer's secret base, and borrowed the spare key to the study. "The keys are not missing at all," Jane said to the air, her knuckles white. There was only a desk lamp on in the evidence room late at night. Jane opened the manuscript of Bloody Finale again, and suddenly a yellowed note floated down between the pages. The handwriting was Javier's, with coffee stains around the edges. "The real murderer will not appear at the end, but hide at the beginning." She flipped to the first chapter, The Death of the Silver Rose, and her eyes swept over the words "muddy boot prints" on the windowsill. She enlarged the mud seal in the photo, and the diamond-shaped patterns glowed dark yellow under the desk lamp, exactly the same as the one in the corner of the yard the night before. The rain outside the window just stopped when Jane stuffed the photo of the muddy boot prints into the inner pocket of her windbreaker. She touched the tablet at her waist, and the system icon glowed a faint blue in the dark. The old people in the community always say that every brick in the old city holds a secret. Perhaps the owner of this pair of shoes lives in the alley where Javier lived for 10 years. While Jane was taking photos of her muddy boot prints on the wooden table in the community management office, Marta was wrapping her newly bought baguettes in old newspapers. Diamond pattern, size 38. She tapped the edge of the photo with her knuckles. The mud print on the windowsill of Javier's study is the same pair of shoes as the one in the corner of the yard. Marta pushed her reading glasses and pulled out 3 thick ledgers from the metal cabinet. The entry and exit records are filed weekly. Do you want to check the most recent month? As the pen tip moved across the yellowed paper, Jane's breathing suddenly stopped. In the visitor column on June 28, the capital letters Lucio de la Cruz were prominently displayed, and the note read, "Giving away novel material." How long was he there that day? 2 hours. Marta turned to the surveillance record page. The surveillance was broken, and it took 3 days to repair, but I remember it clearly. When he left, he was holding a black cloth bag in his arms, and half of a metal pipe was exposed at the corner. Metal pipe. Jane thought of the unmelted copper block in the evidence room. The screen in the police station's monitoring room was flashing with snow. The guy from the technical department scratched his head. The cameras in the back alley are old-fashioned and only last for 7 days. Jane dug her nails into her palms. Between 10 and 12 on the night of the crime. The scene jumps to 11:47, where a man in a dark windbreaker climbs over the back wall of Javier's house. The streetlight swept across his drooping left hand. The first section of his index finger was missing, and the skin at the break was unnaturally white. Zoom in. She stared at the man's movement as he lifted his arm to support the wall. The scar on his severed finger looked like a twisted centipede. Check the database for ex-offenders whose left index finger is missing. Half an hour later, the results came back. There is only a record of a fight involving Lucio de la Cruz. The intern's voice trembled. In 2018, he stabbed someone with a broken bottle, and the other person bit off his index finger on his left hand. However, the responding officer was a patrol officer, so his fingerprints were not entered into the system. Under the cold light of the autopsy room, Pedro projected the fingerprint fragments onto the whiteboard. This fingerprint only has the upper half of the fingertip, which is consistent with the contact characteristics of a person with a broken index finger. He circled the pattern with a laser pen. Compared with the right thumb sample taken when Lucio was in prison, the skin texture density is consistent. That is to say, the fingerprints at the scene belong to Lucio's left hand, but this hand has never been recorded in our system. Jane's tablet vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from Irene. Lucio came to the publishing house last Wednesday and said he wanted to see a sample of Bloody Finale, but I dismissed him with unfinalized. She put the tablet on the dissecting table, and the metal edge made a crisp sound. Lucio's house is hidden in the narrowest alley in the old town.
When John pushed open the rusty iron door while showing her police officer ID, a burning smell wafted through the room.
The smelting furnace was still warm, and a half-formed metal rose was placed next to it. In a cardboard box in the corner, Havel's novels were torn into pieces. On the back of one of the book reviews for Game of Shadows, there was a sentence written in red pen. "I can't let him write about me anymore." At the bottom of the drawer lay a brass key. Jane took out the spare key to Javier's house and compared it. The tooth marks matched exactly. The officer checked very carefully. A hoarse male voice came from behind. When Jane turned around, Lucio was leaning against the door frame, his left hand in his windbreaker pocket, the fabric bulging unnaturally at the broken fingers. "Do you really think you are the first person to understand that book?" He tilted his head and smiled, and the scar at the corner of his eye twitched. When Javier wrote "The real murderer is hidden at the beginning," his pen was shaking. Jane put her hands on the handcuffs at her waist. "Come back to the station with me." "What's the hurry?" Lucio took a step forward, his shadow covering the tip of her shoe. "Guess, did he spill the pool of red wine in his study by himself, or did someone help him?" Jane's breathing suddenly stopped. Clara said that she knocked over the wine glass when she slammed the door last Tuesday, in the same location as the scene. Javier died late last Friday night. 3 days is enough time for the wine stain to dry. Lucio's voice was like sandpaper scraping against glass, but the stain still has the sweet smell of wine. He stepped back to the door and unzipped the hem of his windbreaker. Jane's eyes swept over the thing he hid in his waistband. It was half an unfinished copper rose with dark red rust on the edges. "Are you going to arrest me?" He tapped the door frame with his knuckles. "Think first. Is the evidence you have enough to prove a non-existent fingerprint?" Jane stared at the bulge of cloth where his severed finger was, and suddenly remembered the black cloth bag that Marta had mentioned. What Lucio took away that day might not be the material for a novel. "Let's go." She pulled out the handcuffs. "Let's talk about it at the police station." Lucio didn't move. His eyes passed over her and fell on the brass key on the table, and the smile on the corner of his mouth deepened. "You should thank me," he said. "If it weren't for me, no one would have discovered that the great writer you admired had a secret that was dirtier than his novels." Jane's cell phone rang at this moment. It was the technical department. Javier's private cloud drive has been decrypted, and there is a recording in it. A conversation between him and Lucio on June. She stared at Lucio, who was slowly rolling up his left sleeve. The skin on his severed finger was pink, as if the bandage had just been removed. "Let's go," he said. "I have been waiting for this day for a long time." The moment Jane put the handcuffs on him, she smelled a faint burnt smell on him, exactly the same as the lingering copper smell in the smelting furnace. The street light at the entrance of the alley suddenly went out. In the darkness, Lucio's voice was like a snake's tongue. "Do you think you'll win if you find the key?" He laughed softly. "I already changed the lock with that key." Jane's finger hovered over the phone screen. She suddenly remembered what Javier had written on the note. The real murderer was hidden at the beginning. At this moment, the man standing in front of her was pointing to a darker place with his broken hand. Jane had just put the cuffs on Lucio's wrists when her phone vibrated and became hot in her pants pocket. The voice of the technical department came out from the speaker. The cloud disk recording has been analyzed, and you need to confirm it immediately. She stared at Lucio's rolled-up left sleeve, where the new scar on his severed finger was glowing red. The man who had just said that the key had been changed in the lock long ago, and that Javier was hiding a secret dirtier than a novel, now smiled with his head down, like a cat waiting for a mouse to enter a cage. "Come with me to the technical department first." Jane pulled the handcuff chain. "Don't you like to tell secrets? Now is the time." Lucio did not resist. When he was taken into the police car, he deliberately rubbed the door frame with his severed finger. Jane stared at the light pink scar, her back teeth clenched until they were sore. Marta said that 3 months ago, Lucio came to the community to borrow tools, and there was a hot piece of metal wrapped in a black cloth bag. At the time she thought it was material for a novel, but now she thought that the temperature might have come from a smelting furnace. The technical department's recording exploded the moment the play button was pressed.
"You can't write about those 3 cases."
It was Lucio's voice, hoarse like a broken gong. "They have no evidence. Why do you accuse me?" "Because you did it." Javier's voice was as calm as an ice cone. "I have been investigating for 3 months. The victim's copper ornaments, muddy boot prints, and the metal ingots you hid in prison. If you dare to publish it, I will make your story stop at the first chapter forever." The recording stops abruptly. Jane looked up and saw Lucio tapping the table with his severed fingers, once, twice, as if he was making some kind of secret signal. "You know more about fingerprints than I do," he suddenly said. "There's only my right hand in the database. Left hand." He shook his left hand. 10 years ago I lost my fingertips in the foundry due to molten copper. The prison medical records clearly state that. A chill ran down the back of Jane's neck. She took out her phone and sent a message to Pedro. "Check Lucio's prison medical records. Focus on the left index finger." When I turned around, I caught a glimpse of half a bronze rose in the evidence bag on the table. The rust on the edge was not rust, but coagulated blood. Juan's studio is in the basement of the old town, with half-melted silver and deformed copper candlesticks hanging on the walls. As Jane pushed the evidence bag over, the old craftsman's magnifying glass fell onto the table with a click. This was not bought. He picked up the rose with tweezers. It was made by melting at least 5 old things. "Look here." He pointed to a thin line on the inside of the petals. "This wave pattern is a limited edition at the 2013 Madrid Jewelry Fair, and is only made into brooches for female customers." Jane's heart skipped a beat. In 2013, it was the timeline of the police's unsolved rose killer case. 3 women disappeared, and metal roses were left at the scene. And this. Juan pulled out a microscope. "The melt is mixed with gold powder. It's not ordinary gold." He pulled up an old photo. In 2012, a girl named Laura Martinez disappeared. Her mother said that the necklace she wore was a gold copper alloy with LM engraved on it. Jane's phone vibrated at this moment. Pedro's voice message, Lucio's 2012 foundry accident record. "The index finger of my left hand was burned by 1200 degrees molten copper, and the end of the fingerprint was missing. When the prison recorded fingerprints, only the right hand was taken, so the half fingerprint at the scene could not match." She stood up suddenly, and the chair made a sharp sound on the concrete floor. Lucio's place was cleaner than expected. There was a dark smelting furnace in the basement, and next to the furnace was a piece of unmelted metal debris. The 2 letters LM glowed coldly under Jane's strong flashlight. "This is Laura's necklace." She took a picture of the evidence bag, the veins on the back of her hand throbbing. "She was last seen near the foundry where you worked on March 5th. Lucio crossed his legs in the police car. "So, is it illegal to melt down old metal to make roses?" Jane ignored him. She called up the clue collection system and dragged all the furnace photos, copper rose test reports, and medical records into the map. The red connection line instantly entangled the three nodes of the Rose Killer case, Javier's manuscript, and Clara's red wine stains. When the system alert sounded, a new text message popped up on her phone. You think you've caught the murderer. The real end has just begun. The sender's name field was blank, but the signature hurt her eyes. JR, the initials of Javier Romero. Jane's fingertips rested on the system's generate report key, but she was hesitant to press it. The clock on the wall pointed to 2 in the morning. The moonlight outside the window shone through the blinds, casting a spiderweb-like shadow on Lucio's broken finger scar. She suddenly remembered what Javier had written on the note. The real murderer is at the beginning. At this moment, next to the Lucio node in the center of the system map, another, unnamed red dot is slowly emerging, like a drop of freshly fallen blood. Jane was staring at the bloody red dot on the system map when her phone vibrated in her palm. The screen was blindingly bright, and the 2 letters JR were like 2 nails piercing into the retina. Crime Squad office. She yelled into the intercom, and almost knocked over the evidence box when she turned around. The photo of Lucio's smelting furnace was still spread out on the table. The LM mark glowed coldly under the lamp, the same color as the bulging blood vessels on the back of her hand. Irene's phone rang 7 times before it was connected. 2:30 in the morning. Detective Jane. The editor's voice was hoarse from being woken up. Unless Javier is resurrected, nothing will happen. He may have really kept a backup plan. Jane interrupted her. There is an encrypted chapter in the manuscript, titled The Rebirth of the Silver Rose. There was silence on the other end of the phone for 3 seconds. It's in his old computer. Irene suddenly woke up. Last year, I helped him organize the information. He said, some stories should be left to the right people. The password is the International Standard Book, number of the first edition of Shadow Game. You must know it. When Jane rushed into the evidence room, the technical department was still testing Javier's study computer. She unplugged the cable directly, and the sound of the keyboard typing was particularly harsh in the empty room. When the 7th digit of the International Standard Book number was entered, the hard drive suddenly made a click sound, and the hidden folder slowly opened like a black lotus. The moment she opened the document of the rebirth of the Silver Rose, her breathing paused for a moment. The murderer would sneak into the study at 2 a.m. on March 15. Using the spare key I gave him 3 months ago, he would strangle me with a cowhide rope and put the copper rose in my hand, because he didn't know that I secretly filmed him smelting old metals during the interview. Jane's fingers trembled as she scrolled down. The police will find muddy boot prints, detect the material of the rose, and follow the fingerprints of the severed finger to find Lucio. But they don't know that all this is a script I wrote. A sentence at the end of the document made her scalp tingle. This is the only way he can stop me from revealing the truth. So he deliberately angered Lucio. Jane waved her laptop at Irene on the video call. He used the novel to cover up the serial murder case and forced that lunatic to do it. Irene's dark circles were particularly obvious on the screen. Last week he said death is the best publicity. I thought it was a crazy writer. She suddenly paused. Wait, have you checked his medical records? The medical records lie in Clara's gallery office. When Jane pushed the door, the other party was whispering into the phone. 100,000 euros is not enough. The encrypted chapters in the manuscript are worth at least this much. She turned around and saw Jane, and her phone fell on the Persian carpet with a pop. You contacted a private publishing company to sell the manuscript. Jane picked up the phone. On the screen was a draft of the exclusive copyright pre-order agreement. Javier's will said that the copyright of the work belongs to the Madrid Municipal Library. Clara dug her nails into her palms. My mother said this before she died. Her voice trembled. 5 years ago he had a brain tumor, and the doctor said he would only live for 3 years at most. He knew he didn't have enough time, so he used death as his last act. Jane's temple was throbbing. So he designed the copycat murder to both complete the novel and send Lucio to prison. He said this was the perfect finale. Clara grabbed the red wine glass on the table. The wall of the glass was still stained with brown wine. Jane remembered that in the photos taken at the scene, there were the same stains on Javier's desk. He even calculated that the police would find the smelting furnace, and that you would find the encrypted chapter, but he didn't expect that he had a backup plan. Jane interrupted her, and turned to the police car parked outside the gallery. In the trunk, the technical department had just delivered the hidden attachment extracted from Javier's computer. Jane's Adam's apple moved as the video loaded. In the picture, Javier is sitting on a swivel chair in the study, with a familiar oak bookshelf behind him, and a signed copy of Game of Shadows on the top shelf. His temples were sunken, and the left side of his face was unnaturally swollen, but his eyes were surprisingly bright. If you see this video, it means I'm already dead. His voice trembled slightly, as if he was trying to suppress a cough. But my story isn't over yet. Don't forget, the real murderer isn't just one person. The screen suddenly went black. Jane pressed the replay button repeatedly, and only snowflakes were flashing. She looked up and out of the car. The moonlight was climbing up the glass windows of the gallery, making the sign Clara Vega curated look white. The wind lifted the hem of her police uniform, revealing Javier's note in her pocket. The real murderer is hidden at the beginning. The system prompt sounded at this time. Jane opened the atlas and saw that the unnamed red dot was slowly expanding, with fine blood oozing from the edges, like a blooming metal rose. Jane parked the police car in the underground garage. The blue light from her cell phone screen made the corners of her eyes turn red. She dragged the progress bar of the video file repeatedly, and the last 3 seconds of the picture left an afterimage on her fingertips. When Javier finished saying the real murderer is not just one person, the camera suddenly shook half an inch, and a vague outline flashed in the shadow of the oak bookshelf, like a piece of black cloth blown by the wind. She grabbed her laptop and started typing away on the keyboard. The audio spectrum unfolded on the screen. Beyond the peak of Javier's voice wave, there was a very thin, jagged wave looming, with a frequency 2 beats faster than normal breathing. Xiao Wang, from the technical department, answered the phone half an hour ago. His voice was still sleepy. It's a human voice, a male. It's likely that a noise-canceling device was used. At 4 in the morning, the psychological clinic was filled with the scent of bitter almonds. Lola Sanchez's white coat was draped over the back of a chair, and her therapy notes were spread out under the lamp. 2 months ago, he started saying, "Someone wants to help me finish the final chapter." She pushed her gold-rimmed glasses and tapped the tip of her pen on the record of September 17. The original words were, "That shadow knows how to end the story better than I do," but he refused to say who it was. Jane's finger stopped on the line. What he feared was not death, but being misunderstood. Lola's pen tapped lightly on the table. "You should ask Irene. Javier always has backup scripts hidden in his computer." Irene's office was lit with a cool white light. She stared at the computer screen, her fingertips flying on the touchpad. The backup file was transferred at 3 a.m. last Thursday. The encryption code is the key date in Shadow Game. Her eyelashes trembled when the voice processed by the voice changer leaked out of the speakers. Javier's voice was like crumpled paper. "If I die, please don't rush to close the case. Some truths have not yet surfaced. They are all waiting for this moment." Jane's Adam's apple moved. Irene turned off the player, leaving wet marks on the table with the bottom of her coffee cup. "He's been saying recently that novels need group portraits. I thought it was a creative bottleneck." At this moment, the phone in the technical department rang. Pedro's voice mixed with the hum of the laboratory. "The chip fragments in the copper rows have been restored." Jane heard the sound of the printer spitting out paper. The tracking device from 10 years ago, Model L7, has long been eliminated by the police. Pause for 2 seconds. But there is no record of cooperative surveillance in Lucio's file. Jane stood in Javier's study, the moonlight slanting in through the window, and the muddy boot prints on the windowsill were bluish-gray. She fished out the metal rose from the evidence bag, the copper color warm against her fingertips. The chip thing was like a needle pricking his temple, a tracking device from 10 years ago that Lucio had never touched. "Who was that? Who do you want me to see?" she asked softly into the air. The wind squeezed in through the window, rustling the spine of Game of Shadows. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a supplementary report from the technical department. The last registered use of the L7 equipment was in 2013's Operation Nightingale, an undercover mission codenamed Rave. Jane's finger hovered above the screen, but she didn't click on it. The night outside the window was so dark that she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. Once, twice, like someone knocking on the stage curtain. Jane's phone vibrated in her palm. The 4 words, Operation Nightingale, in the technical department's supplementary report were like red-hot nails that drove directly into her nerves. She gritted her teeth and flipped through the address book. Her fingertips paused for 3 seconds on the call record of the Archive Management Office. Regarding the undercover mission 10 years ago, the only person who could have a say in the bureau was the retired director, Duran. Duran's address was obtained from an old colleague 20 minutes later. The elevator in the old residential building was stuck on the 3rd floor. She ran upstairs clutching her work ID. The 4th floor stairwell was filled with a musty smell. When she knocked on 402, a young woman in a beige sweater opened the door. "Looking for my dad?" The woman took a half step back, her hair brushing the faded faux character on the doorframe. He was hospitalized last week for pulmonary fibrosis. When she reached out her hand, Jane caught a glimpse of the silver chain on her wrist, with an L-shaped metal piece hanging from it. The curve was strikingly similar to that of the chip fragment. "Isabella Duran." Jane showed her ID. "Javier Romero's assistant." The woman's pupils shrank. Jane's eyes swept across the shoe rack in the entrance hall. On the top shelf was a pair of muddy short boots, the same pattern as the mud marks on the windowsill of Javier's study. "Can we come in and talk?" Jane squeezed in without waiting for an answer. The manuscript of Bloody Finale was spread out on the coffee table in the living room, with a fountain pen, pressing down on half a page of handwritten comments. Isabella wanted to collect it, but Jane grabbed the notebook. Faster. There was an old photo on the inside of the cover. Duran in police uniform holding a baby, and the background was the police station bulletin board in 2013. The title was Operation Nightingale Launched. L7 device. Jane slapped the photo on the table. "How did the tracker used in the undercover mission your father was in charge of 10 years ago end up in Javier's copper rose?" Isabella dug her fingers into the cracks of the sofa. Jane noticed that she was wearing a copper ring on her ring finger, with a crooked rose engraved on the ring face. The pattern of the ring was 70% similar to the copper rose at the scene. "I'll go get some water." Isabella suddenly stood up and walked towards the kitchen so quickly that she knocked over a cardboard box next to the coffee table. A stack of locked diaries fell out, and the lock of the top one was open, revealing half a page of paper. "JR knows too much. He shouldn't have written Elsie's name into the novel." Jane squatted down and picked up the notebook. JR is Javier's initials. Lucio de la Cruz's initials were also LC. But Jane turned to the last page of the diary, dated 3 days before Javier's death, with the following scribbled words. "They say this is to protect Dad. But who?" "That's my college diary." Isabella rushed back from the kitchen, her nails scraping across the back of Jane's hand as she grabbed the book. "You have no right to look through my personal belongings." Jane didn't let go. She stared at the red corners of Isabella's eyes, and suddenly remembered what Javier's psychiatrist said, that before he died, he always mentioned someone wants to help me complete the final chapter. Could it be Isabella? The phone vibrated at this moment. It was a surveillance screenshot sent by the technical department. Clara Vega entered the underground bar at 2 in the morning, and Mark Hammond slipped in through the back door half an hour later. "Do you have a key?" Jane said. stuffing the diary into the evidence bag. Clara's apartment or Mark's. Isabella took 2 steps back and bumped into the refrigerator. I don't know what you are talking about. You know. Jane took a half step closer. The spare key to Javier's study was lost 3 months ago, and you clean up his study every Wednesday, right? She pointed to the manuscript on the coffee table. At 3 o'clock in the morning last Thursday, Javier sent an encrypted backup. The password is the key date of Shadow Game, November 23rd, 1997, the anniversary of his mother's death. Who else knows this date besides Irene? Isabella's lips began to tremble. Jane didn't ask any more questions. As she turned to walk out, she caught a glimpse of Isabella's reflection in the entrance mirror. She was taking out her cell phone and typing quickly. The surveillance footage of the underground bar was obtained by Jan through the local police. In the picture, Clara pushed a USB drive to Mark, who sneered while holding a glass of whiskey. Publish anonymously? Your brother's fans will tear us apart, but I have the copyright. Clara's voice was obscured by the bar music. As long as his final chapter is not published, we can... The script has been rewritten. Mark interrupted her, tapping the table with his knuckles. The new ending is even more exciting. Your brother would never have expected it. Jane felt goosebumps on the back of her neck. When she contacted the team to apply for a search warrant, the red marks on the back of her hand from Isabella's scratches were still hot. Mark's apartment was in the Art Nouveau district. He was standing in the living room in his bathrobe with a half-finished glass of red wine in his hand when the combination lock clicked open. Detective, this is trespassing. He tugged at the collar of his robe. Unless you have, here's the search warrant. Jane shook the document and glanced at the third shelf of the bookshelf. There was a book with a gold cover, the title of which was Bloody Finale, Rebirth of the Silver Rose Tea. Mark's face turned pale instantly. When Jane pulled out the book, a note fell out from between the pages. On it was Javier's handwriting. Mark, if you steal my plot again, I will send the evidence of your plagiarism to the publisher. The moment she opened the book, Jane's breathing stopped. The title of Chapter 3 is Female Detective Discovers Chip in Bronze Rose. Chapter 5 details how she locked onto Lucio through muddy boot prints, even down to the exact movement she made when she touched the rose in Javier's study. This is impossible. Jane turned to the last page, which ended with the following words. When the detective opened the novel, she finally understood that she was also part of the script. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Isabella, in encrypted garbled code, but when Jane used Javier's Game of Shadows as a code book, she decoded it and found only one line of text. Don't believe any ending on paper. The real author is never in the signature column. Jane looked up at Mark. He was staring at the book in her hand, with a sneer on his face. The moonlight from outside the window filtered through the blinds, casting tiny rays of light on the spines of the books, which looked very much like the shape of the muddy boot print on the windowsill of Javier's study. She clenched the book tightly, her knuckles turning white. The idea of reviewing Silver Rose Rebirth 2 overnight exploded in her mind. But before that, she had to find out who had turned her life into someone else's novel. When Jane parked her car in the underground garage of the police station, the copy of Silver Rose Reborn the 2 on the back seat was wrinkled by her. She pulled off her seatbelt and rushed into the office. The desk lamp clicked on at 2:17 in the morning, and the rubbing sound of book pages was louder than her heartbeat. Chapter 3, Paragraph 3. When Detective Jane Elliott was 7 years old, she was chasing balloons on the streets of Barcelona, and saw her parents' car being hit by a truck. She squatted in the green belt and cried until her voice was hoarse, holding half a piece of uneaten almond candy in her hand. The paper trembled between my fingers. Jane dug her nails into her palms, a detail not even her therapist knew. Turning to Chapter 5, she always touched the drawer of the bedside table 3 times before going to bed, where her parents' wedding ring was placed. She suddenly opened the drawer of her desk. and the silver ring was lying on the faded blue velvet, exactly the same as it was written in the book. A photo falls out of the last page. Jane almost knocked over the lamp when she picked it up. The photo showed her at the age of 12, secretly trying on the nun's police badge brooch in front of the mirror in the corridor of the orphanage. Written in red pen on the back was the following: "Did you become a police officer because you wanted to be closer to the truth? Or did you want to be closer to the death of your parents?" Knock knock. The office door was pushed open half an inch. Mark leaned against the door frame, his nightgown replaced with a dark grey suit, shaking a cowhide envelope in his hand. "Did you finish reading? Do you need me to explain?" Jane slammed the book on the table, and the cover made a dull sound. "Who wrote this? Do you think Javier is the only author?" Mark pulled his cufflinks, and the envelope fell in front of her. "I received it half a year ago. It said that if I change the ending according to the outline they gave, I can get 2 million euros in profit. By the way," he tapped the photo with his knuckles, "so that some people will never find evidence of my hiring a ghostwriter." Jane ripped open the envelope. There was a blurry watermark on the lower right corner of the letter, like a signature that someone had deliberately rubbed off. The last sentence hurt her eyes. "Make sure the detective's investigation track is in sync with the novel. Her death scene will be the perfect finale." Death scene. She looked up sharply. Mark pointed to the book in her hand. "Read it yourself." The paragraph circled in red on the last page reads, "At 3:07 a.m., the detective fell on the carpet in Javier's study, with marks on the back of his neck, and his right hand tightly holding an iron rose. The same rain was falling outside the window as it was on the night of the crime." Jane's watch read 2:58 as she grabbed her car keys and rushed out. The wipers drew sharp arcs on the windshield, and the moment she rushed into Javier's study, the wall clock struck 3 o'clock. "Activate the clue system," she said to the air. The hidden camera on the ceiling lit up red, and the projection screen on the wall expanded with a buzz. The coordinates of muddy boot prints, fingerprint comparison reports, and call records of all suspects floated up like pieces of paper, gradually connecting into a network map. Jane stared at the screen and her breathing suddenly stopped. In Isabella's communication records, there were 17 text messages without displaying the number, all sent 1 week before Javier's death. Cross-check IP addresses. The screen flashed twice, and a dark web address popped up. Jane's phone vibrated at this time. It was a message from Juan from the technical team. "Isabella's notebook has been cracked. You need to come and see it in person." The laptop was placed in the technical team's secure room. Juan hit enter, and the code poured out like a waterfall, finally stopping at a forum page. Final draft. Experiment in scripting reality. Javier's death report was marked Experiment 001, and the attachment contained all the revision records of his unfinished manuscript. There is a note at the bottom. Detective Jane Elliott. Experiment 00 Sol. Estimated completion date 30 days after Javier's death. When did she upload it? Jane's voice tightened. 3 days ago. Juan pushed up his glasses, but there was a scheduled email, and the recipient was... He paused. Your private email. Jane's cell phone rang. The title of the unread email is Final Reminder to the Experimental Subject. The moment she clicked it, the landline on the desk suddenly rang, and it was Isabella's number. "Go ahead." She picked up the phone. The other party was silent for 5 seconds, and the background sound was the sound of shuffling papers. "You think you're solving a case?" Isabella's voice was like cotton wool soaked in water. "In fact, from the day you picked up Javier's autographed book, you became a character in the story." "Who's the screenwriter?" "A real author won't sign his name anywhere." A slight click came from the phone, like the sound of a key turning. "Also your death scene." "Hello? Hello?" The busy tone blasted shrilly. Jane stared at the dark web address on the computer screen and swiped her finger across the address book to Fernando Aligre. an old classmate from the National Cybersecurity Agency. The last time they met, he helped her restore the old surveillance footage of his parents' car accident. The rain outside the window suddenly got heavier. The moment she pressed the call button, she saw a new message pop up in the corner of the laptop screen. Experiment. Jane's cell phone was still clutched in her palm, and Isabella's words were like a needle piercing her eardrum. She took 2 deep breaths and pressed Fernando's number heavily with her thumb. The phone was answered on the 3rd ring, with the sound of keyboard tapping being the background sound. "Fernando, I need to track the IP link of a dark web forum." She went straight to the point. "The forum is called Final Draft, Experiment in Scripting Reality. And Juan just cracked the address. Send it over." There was no extra emotion in the other party's voice. Jane heard the sound of the mouse clicking. 5-layer routing jump. "Interesting." Pause for 5 seconds. "Wait for me 2 minutes." Jane sent the address over and turned to grab her coat from the back of her chair. When passing by the technical team, Juan was holding a fragment of the copper rose and adjusting the angle under a microscope. He looked up and made a wait a moment gesture to her. She nodded without stopping. Javier's name was scheduled in Lola's psychological clinic appointment book every Wednesday at 3 p.m., without fail. Lola was locking the last stack of medical records into the filing cabinet when the clinic doorbell rang. She saw Jane and paused with her finger on the lock handle. "Detective, I didn't think we would have any visitors today." Javier's treatment notes. Jane showed his ID.
I need to see the last 3 months.
Lola's pupils shrank. She turned, opened the drawer, and handed out a leather notebook. Jane turned to the last page, and the edges of the paper were jagged. Someone had cut off half of it with a knife. The page was torn 2 weeks ago. Lola lowered her voice. He was in a very unstable mood that day. He said, "Someone wants to use my novel to test the limits of human behavior." She took out a crumpled piece of paper from the pocket of her white coat. "He stuffed this into my pocket before he left. He said that if anything happened to him, I should hand it over to the police." Jane unfolded the page, and the words "narrative control plan" pierced her eyes. The draft agreement stated that the target object is guided to complete specific behaviors through literary narratives, and the signature column at the end was blank, with only a handwritten note. When the observer becomes the observed, the game really begins. The vibration of the phone interrupted my thoughts. It was a message from Juan. "The chip fragments have been processed. You'd better come over now." The lights in the technical room were dimmed, and Juan turned the microscope towards Jane. "See that silver line? I used laser peeling to extract this microtext." He clicked on the computer, and a line of tiny letters popped up on the screen. Subject, JR. Phase 1 completed. Next target, observer. Jane's temple was throbbing. JR is the abbreviation of Javier Romero, and observer. She thought of the character in the story on Isabella's phone call, and a chill ran down the back of her neck. "Do you want me to hack into their server?" Juan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Jane shook her head and pulled out her phone to log into an anonymous browser. She entered the dark web address, registered a new account, and typed in the title bar, "I have entered the second stage, please indicate the next step." The moment the send button was pressed, a thin layer of sweat broke out on her back. 3 minutes later, a notification popped up in the inbox. Attached to the encrypted email was a PDF with a striking title, Fatal Script, Act 2, Hunter Backlash. She scrolled quickly, cold sweat running down her spine into her collar. The document detailed the characteristics of the next suspect, male, an anonymous editor, who had participated in Javier's old work Shadow Game, with a black mole on his left earlobe. "Jane," a colleague suddenly shouted from outside the door. "The security system in your apartment has sounded the alarm, saying that a stranger forced the doorbell." Jane's fingers slipped on the mouse. She grabbed her coat and rushed out. Amid the sound of police sirens, her phone received a real-time image from the apartment's camera. A man in a camel coat was standing at the door, holding a letter in his hand. He looked up at the camera, a vague smile forming at the corner of his mouth. By the time she rushed into the apartment corridor, the man was gone. There was a letter hanging on the door handle, with a red pen writing on the front of the envelope. If you still want to live to the end, don't pursue it any further. Jane's hands were shaking as she held the envelope. She turned to the back and saw the postmark showing it had been mailed this morning from the old town of Madrid. The letter was unfolded, and there was only one sentence inside. The handwriting was crooked, as if it was deliberately disguised. Carlos Miguel knows all the answers, but his mouth is tighter than Javier's coffin lid. It's still raining outside the window. Jane stared at the name on the letter and fished out her cell phone to access the police database. The moment I entered Carlos Miguel, the system prompted no matching records. She opened Javier's reader directory again. No social media follow-up list. No, and she couldn't even find the name in the list of partners provided by the publisher. Finally, she found Havel's old work, Game of Shadows, and saw a line of small words at the bottom of the acknowledgement page. Special thanks to the anonymous consultant for his professional guidance on the details of the crime. Jane closed the book and placed her fingertips on the words anonymous consultant. Raindrops hit the window glass, blurring her reflection. As Jane's fingers typed Carlos Miguel on the keyboard, the blue light of the screen cast gray shadows under her eyes. There was no record in the police database, but 37 related results popped up on the academic platform. From psychological manipulation model in Javier Romero's criminal narrative, to prediction of the plot direction of Blood finale, deduction of behavioral patterns based on the first 7 chapters, and each paper was published precisely before the deadline for Javier's new work. The mouse wheel is stuck. The conclusion of the last paper reads, when the silver rose appears in chapter 3, the murderer will use the spare key to complete the loop in chapter 4. She flipped through Javier's unfinished manuscript. There was indeed a note in chapter 3, with crooked pencil writing. The silver rose was changed to copper, which is more in line with the characteristics of the victim's relics in the old case. No author photo, she whispered. The author profile column of all papers only has the 5 words independent researcher. The email address suffix is garbled, and the contact address is filled with narrative boundary. The phone vibrates. Isabella's number bounced on the screen. Jane's knuckles turned white as she pressed the answer button. 3 p.m., San Miguel Market. Isabella's voice was softer than last time. Don't let anyone else follow. Jane arrived 20 minutes early. She stood behind the roasted chestnut stand and watched Isabella, wrapped in a camel-colored scarf, walk through the crowd. The assistant wasn't wearing her usual pearl necklace today, and there was a light red scratch on her collarbone. They call it the final draft, Isabella began, as she sat down, steam rising from her cup of hot cocoa. A secret forum of readers, researchers, and even authors. Javier knew. He called it the most vivid crime scene. Member list, Jane interrupted. Isabella dug her nails into her palms. I only know 3 names, but the one who told them was found in an alley last month. His wrists were cut into the cross locks from Game of Shadows. She suddenly grabbed Jane's wrists. The more you investigate, the more you look like a character in his book. They are writing about you, Jane, using your fear as ink. Jane's cell phone rang at this moment. Erin's number. She pulled out her red wrist and pressed the answer button. I found this in Javier's safe. The editor's voice trembled with restraint. It's the contract he signed with the Narrative Boundaries Institute about using the plot of the novel to conduct a behavioral simulation experiment. The fax machine started spitting out paper. Jane stared at the last page. The words Isabella Duran in the signature column were like a bolt of lightning. The handwriting was exactly the same as the contact information Isabella had written on the napkin just now. Fernando sent a message. A colleague poked his head in. He hacked into the final draft forum and said there's a new article. When Jane rushed into the technical room, Fernando was staring at 3 screens. The one in the middle was lit up with the unsigned observer collapse simulation report, with the timeline accurate to the minute. At the 48th hour, self-doubt arose due to the lack of clues. At the 66th hour, stress-induced insomnia was caused by the threat letter. At the 72nd hour, "That's enough," Jane interrupted. She grabbed her coat and walked out, with rain pouring down her collar and into her back. One of the streetlights downstairs in the apartment building was broken, and there was a damp and moldy smell in the corridor. The study door was ajar. Jane took out his pistol and slowly pushed the door open with the barrel against it. The ceiling light was not on, and moonlight leaked in through the window, illuminating the first edition of Shadow Game on the desk. She had clearly put it in the bedroom safe this morning. There was an extra line of words on the title page, written in red ink. The handwriting was exactly the same as the threatening letter. "Dear Hunter, this time it's your turn to escape." Jane's fingers rubbed over the words. The red ink had not yet dried, leaving a fishy smell on her fingertips. She took 2 steps back, and her lower back hit the desk. The drawer suddenly popped open automatically. There were 7 unopened letters neatly stacked inside. The postmark on the top one was the day Javier died. She reached for the silver USB drive in her breast pocket. That is the Bureau's new clue collection system, which can string all the fragments together into a network. At this moment, the edge of the metal was digging into my skin, like a heartbeat about to awaken. Jane's fingers left a crescent mark on the edge of the silver USB drive.
The prompt sound of the clue collection system came out from the chest pocket. It was the full text of the observer collapse simulation report that Fernando had just sent over.
She pulled out the USB drive and plugged it into the computer, and the screen was instantly filled with green data streams. The system automatically pops up a comparison window. On the left was the timeline in the report: self-doubt at the 48th hour, insomnia at the 66th hour, and the 72nd hour. Her action record popped up on the right. 48 hours ago she was in the morgue, staring at the marks on Javier's neck and leaving fingerprints on the copper rose in the evidence bag. 66 hours ago she was in the corridor of the police station, tearing up the anonymous, threatening letter, and at 3 in the morning she stared at the ceiling and counted the number of revolutions of the ceiling fan. 72 hours ago she pinched the mouse abruptly. The prediction for the 72nd hour in the report was triggering a critical decision point, and her action record was the time when she decided to come to the apartment alone to check for clues early this morning. The keyboard was slammed loudly. Jane knocked over her coffee cup as she grabbed her coat, and the dark brown liquid spread across the report printout, blistering the word observer into a blur. When she rushed into the technical room, Fernando's chair back was still shaking. She had just yelled at him to check the forum administrator's IP. "We've located it." Fernando's voice was trembling. "It's in the abandoned San Ignacio printing factory in the northern suburbs of Madrid. The last login time was 10 minutes ago." The wipers drew sharp arcs across the windshield. Jane stepped on the accelerator to the bottom. The police lights in the rearview mirror were blindingly red. She didn't call for backup. The clue collection system vibrated in the passenger seat, and a satellite image of the printing factory jumped on the screen. Rusty chimneys, collapsed walls, the outline of the innermost warehouse, and the floor plan of Javier's study overlapped to form a shadow. The lock on the iron door is new. When Jane kicked it open, sawdust burst into her trouser legs, and a musty smell mixed with the smell of damp pulp came out. She took out her pistol and swept the barrel across the wall. The entire wall was covered with Javier's manuscript annotations, densely circled in blue, red, and black pens. There was a sketch pinned in the middle of the room. The words "Jair's the real silver rose" were circled 7 times in red pen. The arc of the letters J and A was exactly the same as the handwriting in the threatening letter.
"Welcome to Act 2, Jane."
The voice came from above. Jane looked up suddenly and saw a red dot flashing from the camera on the ceiling. The laptop on the desk lit up, and the screen showed her at the moment. The hand holding the gun was shaking, and the comments on the back were wrinkled by cold sweat. Now you have two choices. Leave, or, the voiceover paused, become the protagonist. Jane's gun is pointed at the camera. When she turned around, she kicked something and looked down to see half a brass button stuck in the crack of the floor. The pattern was exactly the same as the metal residue she had overlooked in the muddy boot print on the windowsill at Javier's death scene. The clue collection system suddenly beeps. Jane pulled out the USB flash drive, and the association map on the screen flashed wildly. Copper rose, copper ornaments of the victim of the old case, Lucio's smelting furnace, muddy boot prints, custom-made shoes from a shoe store near the printing factory. Background of the photo when Javier interviewed Lucio 3 months ago, and the string of letters marked in red by the system, J.A. Jane Elliott. She rushed to the computer, and as soon as her finger touched the power button, she felt a sudden chill on the back of her neck. The footsteps came from the corridor behind me, very slow, like counting the floor tiles. Jane turned and raised her gun, but the barrel was pointed at Lola Sanchez's forehead. The psychiatrist's white coat was stained with mud, and his right hand was in his pocket, with his knuckles in an unnatural arc. Do you think you are the first person to finish reading this book? Lola's voice was as light as a sigh. Actually, her eyes swept across the comments behind Jane. You are the last one to be written in. Jane's back was pressed against the wall. The pages of the manuscript rustled in the draft, and one of them fell at Lola's feet. On it was written in Javier's handwriting. When the hunter finds himself in the script, the climax of the second act really begins. There was a subtle electronic sound coming from Lola's pocket. Jane's thumb tightened on the trigger, but paused the moment the safety was touched. She heard her own heartbeat, mixed with the prompt sound of the clue collection system, repeating the string of letters. Just now, J. She took a half step back, her heel crushing the brass buttons beside her foot. The metal fragments pierced into her socks, causing her eyes to ache. Lola's shadow stretched across the ground, covering the words Silver Rose. Have you retreated enough? Lola smiled. Or are you planning to run? Jane's gun shook even more violently. She stared at the bulge in Lola's pocket and suddenly remembered the 7 unopened letters in Javier's study drawer, all postmarked on the day of his death, and the sender's address read, Institute for Narrative Boundaries. The window at the end of the corridor was blown open by the wind, and raindrops rolled in with a yellowed page of paper. Jane glanced at the date on it, March 15th, 2019, the day Javier first interviewed Lucio. At the bottom of the page, there was a line of small words covered in red pen. Experimental JI recruitment plan. Launched. Lola pulled her hand out of her pocket. Jane's breath hitched. It was a silver gun, exactly the same model as the one she carried. Now Lola pulled the trigger. Do you still think you're on the trail of a murderer? Jane took another step back and her lower back hit the desk. The drawer suddenly popped open with a click, revealing 7 red ink pens neatly stacked inside, with the same letters engraved on the caps. The rain is getting heavier. Jane heard sirens in the distance, but couldn't tell whether it was an illusion or reality. Her eyes swept across the comments on the wall, across the gun in Lola's hand, and finally fell on the computer screen. Herself in the surveillance video, her face as white as a piece of paper. Run. Lola tilted her head. Hunter. Jane's finger tightened on the trigger. She suddenly remembered what Isabella said. They are writing you, using your fear as ink. At this moment, she finally understood that fear was not ink. She herself was the pen. She took another step back, her shoe sole crushing over a piece of manuscript paper. The words on the paper were blurred by being stepped on, and only the last sentence was still clear. Act 3, Hunter. The sirens are getting closer. Jane's back was pressed against the cold wall, and the tip of Lola's gun was only 10 centimeters away from her forehead. She stared at the shadows in the psychiatrist's eyes and suddenly smiled. There was no pride in them, only the same panic that was written into the script as hers. You too, Jane began, her voice hoarse as sandpaper. They wrote about you. Lola's pupils shrank. Jane took the opportunity to take another half step back, knocking over a chair when she turned around. The sound of wood hitting the ground startled the camera, and the image on the screen became distorted, like crumpled paper.
Want to run? Lola raised her gun.
Jane didn't answer. She stared at the red pen with JA engraved on it on the ground, and suddenly bent down to pick it up. The ink swayed in the pen tube like a drop of solidified blood. Police lights flashed at the end of the corridor. Jane looked at the window behind Lola, where the rain was leaving tear marks on the glass. She stuffed the red pen into her trouser pocket, her right hand still tightly holding the gun, and her left hand quietly reached for the USB flash drive in her breast pocket. The clue collection system was still vibrating, and the related map had been connected into an impenetrable network. "It's my turn to write the ending," she said softly. Lola's gun moved another 2 centimeters closer. Jane took a deep breath, turned sharply and rushed to the window. The sound of shattering glass mixed with the sirens, and when she jumped out of the window, she heard Lola shouting behind her, "You can't escape. This is the script." The wind blew into my ears. The moment Jane fell to the ground, she took out a red pen and drew a line on the wall. The red trace was like blood, gradually dissipating in the rain, and finally turned into 2 letters. She fell into the mud and looked up to see Lola in the second-floor window. The psychiatrist's face was blurred by the rain. Only the gun in his hand still glowed coldly. Jane wiped the mud off her face and reached for the red pen in her trouser pocket. A piece of the letter on the pen cap had been worn off, revealing the small words engraved underneath. Subject. Sirens surrounded the printing house. Jane stood up on her knees and heard her colleagues shouting in the distance. She took out her phone and sent a message to Fernando. "Check the Narrative Boundary Research Institute, focusing on the experimental subject recruitment records on March 5th. The rain has stopped." Jane looked up at the window on the second floor, but there was no trace of Lola there. She took out a red pen and drew a cross on her palm, like the wound on the victim's wrist in Shadow Game. The ink had not yet dried, and it had formed a dark red flower on the skin. "The game has just begun," she said to the air. The clue collection system in my trouser pocket suddenly vibrated, and a new prompt popped up on the screen. "Key connection discovered. Lola Sanchez, March 15th. Jane smiled. She tucked the red pen behind her ear and walked towards her colleagues who had gathered around her. The police lights spun behind her, stretching her shadow so long that it just covered the 2 blood-red letters on the wall. Jane did not put down the gun, but slowly stepped back. In the rain, Lola's figure overlapped with a vague outline in her memory. That was the psychologist she met in the victim's home when she was a community police officer, handling a domestic violence case 3 years ago. Jane held the butt of her gun against her lower back, and the rain dripped down the brim of her hat into a collar. The muzzle of Lola's gun dangled 3 feet away like a poisoned needle. She took a half step back. The tip of her shoe brushed the corner of the table, and a hardcover book was turned over. It was a copy of the manuscript of Bloody Finale. The blue mark on the title page pierced her pupils. 40 carat, 25 north latitude, 341 west latitude, which were exactly the coordinates of this abandoned printing factory. Institute for Narrative Boundaries. Jane's Adam's apple moved as she spoke. Lola's index finger was on the trigger, and the rain fell on the barrel of the gun, along her hair. "I'm just a recorder. The director is not here." She raised her chin. The forum stickers on the wall glowed coldly. The letters of final draft were wrinkled by the water, and the small words below were soaked into a ball. "The script has been updated. Please synchronize." Jane's thumb pressed 3 times on the shutter of her phone. As soon as the photo was sent out, Fernando's news exploded. A Hunter backlash simulation log was just circulated on the forum, predicting that JA would contact Carlos Miguel within 6 hours and use police resources to lock up the members. She stared at the phone screen, her nails digging into her palms. Lola, who provided psychological counseling to the victim in a domestic violence case 3 years ago, now overlapped with the memory in the rain. It turned out that they had been weaving a web since then. Carlos. Jane pressed the call button, her voice shaking like a wire in the wind. I know who is behind this. Let's talk when we meet. The person on the other end of the line paused for half a second, and Carlos's coffee-scented laugh came over. Old bookstore, in half an hour. Jane hung up the phone, turned around, and waved her phone to Pedro, who had just rushed into the printing factory. Get the closed-circuit surveillance of the old bookstore for the past 3 months. She also shook the metal detector at Juan, who was crowded at the door. Bring the miniature one. Carlos may have something similar to the copper rose. The rain stopped and the wind brought the smell of ink into my nose. Jane touched the red pen behind her ear, and the mark of subject 007 under the pen cap hurt her skin. She looked out the window at the darkening sky and whispered, "Want to see me act?" The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was new news from Fernando. The forum IP was located near the bookstore. Jane holstered her gun and turned toward the police car. In the rearview mirror, the windows of the printing factory were dark, like an eye that was not closed. She took out a red pen and drew a cross on the fogged car window. Exactly the same wound as the victim in Shadow Game. 1. She rolled down the window. Be at the bookstore 20 minutes early. As the streetlights came on one by one, Jane stood behind the newsstand opposite the old bookstore. Juan's figure flashed out from the alley, holding a bulging black box with a miniature camera in his hand. In the bookstore window, the poster of Javier's early book signing event is still there. He is holding up Game of Shadows, and his smile is frozen in the film. Jane touched a USB flash drive in her chest pocket. The clue system was vibrating, and the name Carlos Miguel in the association map was marked in blood red. She looked at her watch and saw that there were still 17 minutes until the agreed time. Start setting up. Jane nodded to Juan and turned to walk into the alley next to the bookstore. There was a rusty fire hydrant at the foot of the wall. She squatted down and ran her fingertips across the metal surface. There was a new scratch there, as if it had just been carved by something sharp. Jane squinted in the light of her phone. There were bits of copper shavings embedded in the scratches, which glowed dark red in the night. There were footsteps coming from the alley. Jane stood up quickly and gathered the copper filings into her palm. She looked at the shaking wooden sign on the lintel of the bookstore. The 3 words "Old Bookstore" squeaked in the wind, like someone was counting in a low voice. 16 minutes left. She took out a red pen and drew a second cross on her palm. The ink spread along the lines of the palm like a snake waking up. The tip of Jane's leather shoes rolled over the puddle at the entrance of the alley. Juan's shadow swayed on the bookstore glass, and the clasp of the black box clicked shut. A miniature camera had been stuck in the carved gap of the old-fashioned clock. She touched the rubber pad of the metal detection headset behind her ear. This thing was modified overnight by the technical department and can capture metal vibrations with a diameter of more than 3 centimeters within 5 meters. There were footsteps coming from the alley. Jane retreated into the shadow of the newsstand and watched Carlos's camel coat sweep across the threshold of the bookstore. He was holding a brown paper bag in his hand, with half of the spine of a book exposed at the corner of the bag. It was the dark green cover of Shadow Game. The earphones vibrated slightly in my earlobes, and the frequency was exactly the same as the copper rose detected in Javier's study 3 days ago. Jane counted to the 7th bell and pushed open the door of the bookstore. The sound of the bell startled Carlos to look up. His smile was like a glass of warm red wine. You are 10 minutes early, which is in line with your obsession as a book lover. Book fans only read the ending. Jane sat down opposite him and glanced at his bulging coat pockets. When the brown paper bag was pushed towards her, the vibration in her headphones suddenly became sharp. The metal object was only 30 centimeters away from her. The cover of an old edition of the book was rubbing against the table, and there were dark spots of coffee stains on the corners. Jane opened the title page, and the pen words shone coldly under the warm yellow light. Dedicated to future hunters. Her nails dug into her palm, She had seen Javier's signature hundreds of times. The arc of the last stroke of the word hunter was exactly the same as the stroke when he modified the word murderer in the manuscript of Bloody Finale. However, there is no such gift book in the publishing records. Would you like some hot cocoa? Carlos put his hand on the spine of the book, his knuckles resting on a ridge. Jane ran her thumb over the seams along the spine of the book. Something felt wrong. Something thicker than paper was stuffed in between the pages. Bathroom. She grabbed the book. Bureau of Light. Juan's breathing was rapid in the headset. Chip. I'll decode it right away. When Jane stuffed the book into his arms, she glanced at the watch on his wrist. There were still 5 minutes until the agreed time. When he returned to his seat, Carlos was stirring his mug with a silver spoon. You were flipping through the book just now as if you were looking for clues. His eyes were abnormally bright, just like the female detective in Game of Shadows. Jane tugged at her collar. You're talking about Bloody Finale, right? After all, she paused. The final draft. The mug clattered on the wooden table. Carlos's Adam's apple moved, and his smile cracked. You've read it? Then you should know that the ending can be rewritten. Juan's voice came from the headset. Jane. The list includes Isabella's employment date, Irene's divorce agreement, Clara's inheritance lawsuit, and yours. Community police promotion record, and the closing report of the serial theft case. Pause for 2 seconds. The last sentence is, experimental goal, to verify whether the author can completely control the behavior of real characters. Jane's back teeth felt sore from biting her teeth. She looked into the pupils behind Carlos's glasses, where her reflection was reflected, like a puppet on a string. You're not Carlos Miguel. Her voice was like a knife scraping across metal. You're just another character. Carlos curled his fingers into fists under the table. He was silent for 30 seconds, then suddenly laughed out loud. You're right, I'm just one of the actors they arranged. He stood up, and his coat swept off half a piece of paper towel, on which was pressed a metal badge. The petals of the silver rose glowed coldly under the light, and the pattern and even the position of the notch were exactly the same as the copper rose at the scene. Do you want to rewrite the ending? His back disappeared behind the glass door. The wind blew in the smell of ink, making the pages of Shadow Game rustle. Jane picked up the silver rose, and the coolness of the metal ran up her spine through her fingertips. Juan was still shouting in the headset. Does it need to be sent for inspection immediately? She didn't answer, but just stuffed the badge into the evidence bag and pulled the corners of her mouth at her own reflection in the glass. In Javier's manuscript, the female detective had the same expression when she found the key evidence. The sound of police car sirens came from far away. Jane knocked on the car window and handed the evidence bag to Pedro, who had just braked the car. Composition analysis. Expedited. In the rearview mirror, the wooden sign of the old bookstore was still creaking and shaking. She took out a red pen and drew a third cross on her palm. This time, the ink meandered along the marks of the silver rose, like a snake that finally bit its own tail. Jane was staring at the brass rose in the evidence locker when her phone vibrated in a drawer at the police station. Pedro's voice message was accompanied by the noise of electricity. Analysis of the coating has revealed that there is a nano-level code on the surface which can only be revealed by specific ultraviolet light. She grabbed her coat and rushed downstairs. The bright white light from the laboratory was blinding. Pedro clamped the silver badge on the ultraviolet lampstand. The moment the light blue spot swept across the petals, a line of small words appeared. Final draft, Phase 3, observer replaced. Jane dug her nails into her palms. Observer replacement, she repeated. Who's replacing me? I don't know. Pedro pushed his glasses, but the encoding uses the encryption protocol of the Narrative Boundary Research Institute. Javier mentioned this institute in an interview half a year ago, saying that it was studying the interactive boundary between fiction and reality. A chill ran down the back of Jane's neck. She thought of the list in the mezzanine. Isabella's employment date was circled in red pen, with laboratory assistant written next to it. Isabella's apartment was on the top floor of the old town. When the doorbell rang for the third time, the door opened a crack. The assistant's long hair was loose, and there was unwiped eyeliner at the corners of her eyes, as if she had been pulled out of sleep. "Detective Jane?" Her voice trembled. "It's so late. Go in." Jane squeezed through the door and locked it with her backhand. Half of the manuscript of Bloody Finale was spread out on the coffee table, with a label, Narrative Boundary Research Institute Experimental Log, on the footer. Isabella's Adam's apple moved. "How do you know?" "The list of your experiments is hidden in Javier's book." Jane patted the evidence bag in her pocket, "including your authorization letter to participate in the institute." She took 2 steps closer. "Tell me, who are you?" Isabella suddenly smiled. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a copy of Shadow Game. A work ID slipped out from the spine. "Core researcher, Isabella Duran." When she turned around, her eyes behind the glasses were abnormally bright. Javier volunteered to join the experiment. He wanted to prove that novels can become a blueprint for reality, so even his death has to follow the script. Jane's voice tightened. "No." Isabella shook her head. His death was the only deviation from the script. The original plan was to commit suicide after the public speech. But Luciu, she paused, acted first. She opened the tablet and a blurry surveillance video popped up. In the picture, Javier is sitting in his study, with his manuscript scattered all over the table. He is frantically revising with a red pen. Page 17. The murderer is changed to wearing a glove with thread. Page 23. The time of death is postponed by 2 hours. He suddenly looked up at the camera. "They want me to be a puppet? I want to write my own ending." Jane's phone vibrated at this moment. It was a screenshot of the draft email from Erin. The last line of words made her pupils shrink. "If you see this, please remember that the real Silver Rose is you, whom I wrote. He had long expected that you would find this place." Isabella's voice was as light as a sigh. "Ever since the day you solved a serial burglary case as a community detective, he has been observing you. Your sharpness and persistence are the prototypes of the female detective he wrote." Jane clutched her phone tightly. The coolness of the metal rose seeped out of my pocket, overlapping with the touch of Javier's autographed book. She suddenly remembered the female detective who always made the sign of the cross on her palm when she first read Game of Shadows. It was exactly the same habit she had every time she investigated a case. "You want to control me?" She placed the Silver Rose badge on the table. "Sorry, I decided to write my own ending." Isabella looked at her back and smiled. "He was right about the guy," she said softly, but her voice was cut off by the sound of the door closing. The voice-controlled lights in the corridor lit up one by one with Jane's footsteps. When she reached the 2nd floor, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Observer replaced. New script activated." Jane looked up at the shadows around the corner of the stairs. There was a flash of something there, like a reflection of metal. She reached for the pistol at her waist, resting her knuckles against the cold handle, and walked downstairs step by step. The evening breeze brought the scent of locust flowers from the old city into my collar. She stood under the street light, looking up at the window of Isabella's house. The light was still on, and a figure was swaying behind the curtains, as if writing something. The phone vibrated again. This time it was from Juan. The bureau received an anonymous courier containing a tape labeled "New Script for Jane Elliott." Jane put her phone back in her pocket. She looked at the darkness at the end of the street, where a black car with its lights off and the sound of its engine was faint. She reached up and made a 4th sign of the cross on her palm. This time, the ink crawled up the wrist along the palm lines like a snake ready to strike. The script has just begun. Jane's leather heels tapped on the stone pavement, each step heavier than the one before. Instead of going back to the police station, she turned into a narrow alley. The screen of her phone lit up in her palm. A location message from Juan. "The lights in the studio are on. Just push the door." Juan was bending over to adjust the microscope. when the metal door creaked open. He raised his head, his eyes narrowed behind his glasses. "I knew you wouldn't watch the tape first." Jane pulled the silver rose badge from her pocket and pushed it onto the workbench. "Isabella gave it to me." Juan put on rubber gloves, picked up the badge with tweezers, and held it up to the overhead light. "The surface is silver-plated, and the core is brass." He paused. "It's the same material as the copper rose at the scene." Jane's nails dug into her palms. "Look at the back." The objective lens of the microscope moved slowly downward. Juan's breathing suddenly quickened. "There's something." He turned on the projector, and an image magnified 20 times was projected onto the wall. A line of extremely fine etchings, like a needle scratching into metal. "Final draft. Observer key. Physical key." One turned the badge. "There's a magnetic strip on the edge. It probably corresponds to some kind of authorization lock." Jane's fingers traced the indentations of the writing. Javier said in the video, "Write your own ending." And Isabella said, "He's watching you." At this moment, the coolness of the metal seeped into her blood vessels through her skin. She held the badge tightly. "Can it be copied? We need the original system parameters." Juan shook his head. "But if you use it now, it's like holding a light and going into a black box." At this moment, the cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Fernando with a link to the forum. Jane clicked on it, and the title of New Observer, Adaptability Assessment, stung her pupils. "Buying crepes downstairs at Isabella at 9:17, knocking on the door of Juan's studio at 10:03. Even the movement of her clenching the badge at this moment was marked with a timestamp. They even recorded my breathing rate." Jane put the phone upside down on the table. "We have to stop their tracking once." Juan pulled off his gloves. "Old cinema." Jane looked up. That was the premiere of the film adaptation of Game of Shadows. Javier wrote in the book, "Darkness is the best curtain, hiding all the unspoken truths." She turned off her cell phone and tucked the spare into her boot. The newsstand at the entrance of the alley was still lit, and the owner nodded at her. That was the old man who had helped catch a thief when she was a police officer. Jane lowered the brim of his hat and turned into another road. The red velvet curtain of the cinema was covered with dust. Jane sat in the first row staring at the dancing snowflakes on the screen. Suddenly, the backup phone vibrated and the email alert sounded like a thin needle. Attached is an audio clip with a male voice mixed in with the sound of electricity. "You finally learned how to take the first step." "Who's turning the pages?" Jane said to the air. She was answered by a click sound coming from behind the curtain. She reached for her waist and stopped before touching the handle of the gun. That was the sound of the film turning. The screen lit up, showing Javier's study. He was sitting in a swivel chair, holding a bronze rose in his hand, exactly the same as in the photo at the crime scene. But the next second, the camera zoomed out, and on the bookshelf behind him was a plaque with the words Narrative Boundaries Institute. The phone in Jane's boot was getting hot. She picked up the phone, and Isabella's voice was electric. "Who is behind this, you ask?" "I'd rather know," Jane interrupted her, "whether Javier expected me to ask this question when he wrote about me." The other party was silent for 3 seconds. "Come to the archives room," Isabella said. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, row 3 in area B, the innermost file box." When Jane hung up the phone, she saw Javier on the screen suddenly look up. He mouthed slowly, each word clearly, "Trust your pen." At 2 o'clock in the morning, the voice-controlled lights in the police station corridor lit up as she walked. Chao Wang from the technical department passed by with the case file and yawned. "Sister Jan, your tape is on Lao Chen's desk. The label says new script." Jane stopped at the door of the office and saw her own reflection through the glass. She took out a pen and made a cross on her palm. This time the ink did not stay on the palm lines, but crawled along the wrist into the cuffs, like a snake ready to strike. She pushed open the door and the tape on the table glowed coldly. Tomorrow she would write in the report closing the case. The murderer is Lucio de la Cruz. The motive is clear, and the chain of evidence is complete. But only she knew that a new line of handwriting was waiting on the blank space on the last page of the report. Observers are in place. Jane sat at the typewriter at the police station for 3 hours. She paused at the last line of the third page of the case report. The tip of the pen hovered above the words Lucio de la Cruz, and the ink spread out in a tiny circle on the paper. The searchlight outside the window swept across, illuminating the copper rose fragments on her cuffs. They were secretly scraped off from the evidence bag this morning. She pulled out the last page and replaced the paper. The murderer is Lucio de la Cruz. The motive is clear, and the chain of evidence is complete. It is recommended to seal Javier's unfinished manuscript and related evidence. She typed word by word, and finally added a line of small words. "Ya is online, please prepare to respond." This is a variation of the code in Javier's first work, and the spacing between letters is just right to be recognized by laser scanning of a specific frequency. In the report's copy list, Isabella Duran's name was circled in red pen. At 4 in the morning, Xiao Wang from the technical department passed by her office with a coffee cup in his arms, and poked his head out to take a look. "Sister John, are you not leaving yet? The case closing report is due tomorrow." She stuffed the documents into a sealed bag, her movements as natural as if she were sorting ordinary case files. Xiao Wang yawned and said, "I'll go first. Remember to enter the password when you lock the door." As soon as the door closed, Jane immediately took out a miniature camera from the drawer. When she stuck the camera to the inside of the report cover, the metal buckle hurt her fingertips. This was an old injury left from catching thieves when she was a local police officer, and it would flare up on rainy days. At 7 o'clock, she placed the report on the sheriff's desk. When passing Isabella's office, he deliberately slowed down his pace. Behind the glass door, Isabella was sorting documents, and when she looked up, their eyes met. Jane nodded, and the other party nodded too, like two acquaintances who met by chance in the vegetable market. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jane's personal cell phone vibrated. It was a string of garbled text messages, using the encryption method she and the Javier Book Fans Club agreed upon 3 years ago. Only the true core readers could understand it. She walked into the stairwell and decoded the page number of Havel's first work, Game of Shadows. 12 o'clock midnight, behind the abandoned theater. She sent Juan a message. "Locate my phone with thermal imaging camera. The abandoned theater is on the edge of the old town, and its exterior walls are covered with ivy." Jane arrived half an hour early and walked around the building 3 times. She stuffed a thin wire into the gap of the back door and sprinkled some fluorescent powder on the windowsill. If someone entered early, the wire would break and the fluorescent powder would stick to their shoes. Juan's message came. "There is an unregistered mezzanine underground, and the entrance may be behind the stage curtain." She took out a tiny camera and put it on her collar, then pushed open the door. The smell of mildew mixed with rust hit me in the face. There was a hole in the curtain on the stage, and moonlight leaked in, casting mottled shadows on the floor. Just as Jane walked to the curtain, she heard footsteps behind her. "You already know too much." She turned around and saw Lola Sanchez standing in the 3rd row of the auditorium, a leather diary in her hand. The psychiatrist's white coat disappeared, replaced by a dark gray windbreaker with a silver rose brooch pinned to the collar, exactly the same as the death of the silver rose in Havel's manuscript. Jane kept her hands on her waist, not pulling out her gun. "Are you following me? Javier chose you because you won't be led by the story." Lola opened the diary, and the pages made a crisp sound. He wrote that the ideal reader should be able to rewrite it in reverse. Jane caught a glimpse of the handwriting on the inside pages. It was Javier's, and she knew it so well, with each R curved with a deliberate curve. "How did you get it?" "He gave it to me a week before he died." Lola closed the notebook. "But now is not the time to talk about this." She pointed to the stage. You should go and take a look at the computer in the basement conference room. Before she finished her words, she turned and disappeared into the darkness. Jane's heart beat faster. She lifted the curtain and felt a loose board. I pressed down, and the floor clicked, revealing a flight of stairs leading downwards. The lights in the basement conference room are voice-activated. She stamped her feet, and the incandescent light came on with a buzz. There was a long table in the middle which was covered with dust, except for an old computer that was polished to a shine. She sat down and the computer turned on automatically. The moment the screen lit up, she gasped. The desktop background was Javier's study, exactly the same as the crime scene photo. The document was titled Project. The moment it was opened, dense words poured out. Narrative Control Project Phase 3, Experimental Subject. Jane Elliott, J.A., Observer B07, Mark Hammond. Mark's name hurt her eyes. She quickly turned the pages and saw guide the crime through the manuscript and test the reasoning boundaries of the target person, and if the preset framework is breached, activate the backup plan. Suddenly the lights went out. Jane rolled under the table and felt for the dagger in her boot. Footsteps came from the door, very slow, like counting floor tiles. You're faster than we expected. It was a deep male voice, hoarse with electronic voice modification. But this is only the third chapter. She held her breath. The footsteps stopped in front of the table, and something landed on the keyboard with a click. When the lights came back on, she and the note were the only ones left in the room. Welcome to the director's chair. She picked up the note and saw written on the back in red pen, the information has been encrypted. Tomorrow night at 10 o'clock, on the 3rd floor of the Central Library. Jane backed up all the files on her computer onto a USB drive and stuffed it inside her bra. When she left, she looked back at the diary on the table. It was left by Lola. There was a shallow dent on the cover, as if it had been pressed by something sharp. She took out her phone and sent a message to Juan. Chorola's silver rose brooch, and Mark's call records for the last 3 months. The night wind lifted the corner of her clothes, and the USB drive felt hot against her skin. Tomorrow she will go to the Central Library. But tonight she had to go to Javier's grave first. There was his second diary buried 10 years ago, and the code was the first line of Shadow Game. The moonlight shone on her police badge, reflecting tiny bits of light. On the other side of the city, in an office with a sign that read Narrative Boundaries Institute, a surveillance screen was showing her in an underground conference room. Someone held up a mug with a photo at the bottom. Jane standing at the crime scene holding the pen with the cross in her hand. She took the bait. But will she rewrite the ending? We'll know soon enough. Jane didn't know this. All she knew was that the backup phone in her boot was vibrating again. It was new news from Isabella, using a more complex encryption method. She lowered her head, and the streetlight stretched her shadow very long, like a pen about to fall. Jane hides the USB drive in the rose bushes in front of Javier's grave, where another inactive camera is buried in the dirt. In the moonlight, the silver rose brooch gleamed, but no one noticed that Subject L14 was engraved on the inside of the brooch. As Jane slid the USB drive inside her bra, her fingertips felt the coolness of metal. The lights in the underground conference room were off for 3 minutes, long enough for her to confirm that there was no tracker. But the words of the man with the changed voice just now were like a thorn piercing the back of her neck. She groped her way to the emergency exit at the end of the corridor in the dark. As soon as her phone screen lit up, she received a message from Fernando. Data received. I will give you the analysis results in 20 minutes. Fernando, the technical advisor of the Serious Crime Unit, always eats cold Spanish paella at 3 in the morning. At this moment, the sound of his keyboard can be heard through the phone. With his usual urgency, Jane, the document you brought has been encrypted 7 times, but after the last layer of decryption, there is an account called Director X. Authorization level. Jane leaned against the back of the police car, the night wind blowing the sycamore leaves onto her police uniform, 3 levels higher than Isabella and Lola. Fernando's mouse clicks became more frequent. He can modify the script parameters and adjust the crime scene details in real time. The bronze rose and the missing fingerprints at Javier's death were all changed by him. IP address: private club Ace of Spades, in the heart of Madrid. Jane stared at the red dot on the map on her phone. The club was located right at the junction of the old town and the new art district, like a knife stuck in the city's artery. She took out her police badge and wiped it, the coolness of the metal seeping through her palm into her blood vessels. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Jane stood in front of the club's wrought iron door. The doorman scanned the membership card she handed over. It was a forged version of Havel's Writers Guild ID, with the imprint of his signature still on the edge. The moment the doorman nodded, she smelled a faint scent of sandalwood in the air, exactly the same as in Javier's study. In the monitoring room on the 3rd underground floor, Jane's collection system projected a green pattern on the retinal scanner. Muddy boot prints, the copper rose, the footsteps of the man with a changed voice, all the clues intertwined into a web before his eyes, and finally pointed to the member file cabinet on the wall. At the bottom of the 7th drawer, a photo fell out of a brown paper bag. Manuel Ortega was wearing a library uniform, with the dome of the National Library in the background. Exactly the same scene as 3 months ago, when he showed Jane Javier's old manuscript. Looking for me? Jane turned around and saw Manuel leaning against the doorframe, holding a cup of hot cocoa with white milk foam on the rim. The light caught from the lenses of his glasses, covering his eyes. Director X. Jane reached for the pistol at her waist but didn't pull it out. She needed him to talk. Manuel smiled, his wrinkles revealing fatigue. Do you think Isabella and Lola are the masterminds? They are just the executives. He walked to the filing cabinet and pulled out a stack of experimental logs. 3 years ago, Javier came to us and said that his novels could predict crimes. We didn't believe it until he wrote The Death of the Silver Rose. 3 days later, someone really killed a homeless man according to the script. So you killed him. Jane's knuckles turned white. He wanted to end the experiment. Manuel opened the diary and saw Javier's handwriting on the last page. Novels should not be used as murder weapons. His voice suddenly lowered, but Lucio's appearance proved our guess. Even if the author stops writing, readers will continue. Javier's death is the best example of how novels shape reality. Jane's collection system suddenly beeps. In the map, Manuel's photo was marked as the blood-red master controller, and all the clues were entangled with this name like vines. She pulled out her phone and sent the location to the team. Seal off the Ace of Spades, all exits.
Manuel was stuffing the last page of his lab log into the shredder when the sirens got closer.
Jane rushed over to grab his wrist, but felt something cold. He was wearing gloves, and he looked exactly like the murderer described in Javier's manuscript. The real author. Manuel suddenly turned his head as he was put into the police car. Never signed on paper. Jane stood at the door of the club, watching the taillights of the police car disappear into the night. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She took it out and squinted her eyes at the subject line of the new email. The final chapter is not over yet. The sender's address was garbled, but there was a photo in the attachment. The rose bush in front of Javier's grave, where she hid the USB drive. The soil was turned upside down. She touched the police badge around her neck. The warmth of the metal against her skin was like a fire that was never quite burning. When Jane came home, the living room lamp was on. There was a cup of cold tea on the coffee table, and a note was pressed at the bottom of the cup. The handwriting was familiar to her. Javier's manuscript pen. You thought you found the director. No, kid. You just turned to the next chapter. Jane's fingers wrinkled the edge of the paper. Javier's handwriting was like a scar carved into her skin. Her hand holding the note trembled slightly, until her cell phone vibrated in her trouser pocket, until her thigh went numb. The subject line of the email was, "The final chapter is not over yet." She clicked on the attachment, and a rustling sound of electricity came from the speaker, followed by the crisp sound of a typewriter typing. Click, click, click. The deep voiceover wrapped around her eardrums like a piece of water-soaked rag. You've finished reading his novel, now it's his turn to read yours. She stood up suddenly, and the teacup left a circle of watermarks on the coffee table. His knuckles turned white as he pressed the phone to his ear. Fernando, trace the IP address of this email. This is a copy of the test email you sent 3 days ago. The technical team's voice came from the receiver. The sender used a mirroring program. It's like looking in a mirror. You sent it to yourself. Jane's back teeth were sore from biting them. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her keyring making a crisp sound against the hallway cabinet. The lights were on in Juan's studio, and the scraping sound of metal files could be heard through the glass. Help me extract the waveform of this audio. She pushed the phone over. There's something hidden in the sound of the typewriter. The metal expert pushed up his goggles. The green light of the oscilloscope flickered on his glasses, then suddenly froze. It's Morse code. He pointed to the short dots and long dashes on the waveform graph. The dots are drops, and the dashes are clicks. They overlap with the typewriter rhythm. Jane's breathing paused. The deciphered result was written on the note. The truth is at the beginning, the original place. When she stood at the door of Javier's study, forensic Dr. Pedro had just finished setting up the cordon. Didn't they say the scene has been archived? He flipped through the registration book, his pen stopping in midair. Jane's police badge was against the back of his hand. Her breath missed a beat as the cool light of the UV lamp swept across the bottom of her desk drawer. A very shallow scratch appeared, and the edges of the letters were rough. It was Havel's usual cursive handwriting, dedicated to the last reader. The phone vibrated in my palm. Marta's voice was as sharp as a community radio. Jane. When I was sorting out the surveillance backup, I found a video that had been overwritten. Manuel entered the study 2 days before Javier's death. She heard the sound of keyboard tapping. The time shows 0:17, and he stayed in there for 43 minutes. He didn't appear on the list you gave me. Jane's nails dug into her palms. When the interrogation room surveillance video was turned on, Manuel's fingers moved quickly on the server keyboard, as if he was playing a silent song. Fernando, decipher this. She sent him a screenshot of the video. Whatever you do. 3 hours later, the technical team called her car's Bluetooth. Found it. Fernando's voice trembled. The document is called Final Draft Epilogue, and the title page says completed by J.A. Jane's throat suddenly tightened. She parked her car downstairs of the police station, and the street lights shone through the windshield onto the screen of her mobile phone. The document icon is the usual blood red color in Javier's novels, with a line of small words pressed in the lower right corner. Click to open your final chapter. Her index finger hovered above the screen, and she could hear her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. The night wind blew in through the car window, causing the signed copy of Shadow Game on the passenger seat to flip through the pages. On the blank space on the last page, a line of pencil words appeared. The game has just begun. Jane's finger hovered over the touchpad for 3 seconds. The screen lights up. The first line of the document was in Havel's familiar cursive. To Jane Elliott, the last breaker. Scrolling down, cold sweat slid down her spine into her collar. Inside was a detailed record of her every step in the past 3 weeks. How she found the old mill, frequented by Lucio and the muddy boot prints. How she saw through Isabella's disguised identity as an assistant through the lip prints on Isabella's coffee cup, and even wrote, "At this moment you are squeezing your phone. Your knuckles are white, and the blue light from the screen makes the corners of your eyes red." Fuck. She cursed under her breath and yanked the mouse down. The last paragraph nearly made her knock over her coffee cup. When you read this, you will grab your car keys and go to the police station to pull up Manuel's file. Don't deny it, your fingertips are already rubbing against the keychain. Jane snapped her notebook shut. The fluorescent lights in the police station's technical room hurt my eyes. Fernando pushed over a stack of paper materials with the cover printed with Literary Neural Mapping Experiment, University of Madrid. Manuel is a core member of the project. He pointed to the yellowed experimental records. They hypothesized that when people read, they would unconsciously imitate the character's behavior, and even realities rewritten by novels. Jane took over. She turned to the list of experimental subjects and saw Javier's name on it. The one-way glass of the interrogation room reflected her taut jawline. Manuel sat opposite him, his gold-rimmed glasses sliding to the tip of his nose, as if he was reading an old book that he had read 1,000 times. "You're using me as a guinea pig." Jane slapped the information on the table. "No," Manuel smiled. "We use Javier as the author, and you as the reader. His manuscript is the trigger, and your investigation is the verification process. We want to know whether readers will take the initiative to complete the ending preset by the author when they are fully immersed in the story." So Lucio's copycat killing? Javier wrote it into the manuscript himself. He discovered our experiment and deliberately buried clues to Lucio's old case in bloody finale to force us to reveal ourselves. Manuel pushed his glasses, but he didn't expect that Lucio would really do it out of fear. Sometimes even the author can't control the behavior of the readers. Jane's back teeth were clenched so hard that they hurt. What about this final draft? It was Javier's counterattack. He knew he wouldn't survive the night, so he hid clues in Morse code and preset your reaction in the document. Manuel tapped the table lightly with his fingers. But the action you took to close the document just now was not in any script. There were hurried footsteps in the corridor. Lola Sanchez stood at the door holding a recorder, the ends of her hair still stained with night dew. "I have Javier's last call." The sound of electricity crackled in the recording. Javier's voice was hoarse and filled with the sound of blood foam. "If the experiment must have an ending, don't let me write it. Let someone else." "Who are the others?" Jane pressed the pause button. "It's you." Lola took off her white coat, revealing the black turtleneck sweater underneath. "The Institute has long been divided. One faction wants to terminate the experiment, and the other wants to turn reality into fiction. Javier belongs to the former, and he places his hopes on you because you are the first readers who jump out of the script." Jane interfaced. In the top-floor office of the police station late at night, a few rays of neon light leaked in through the blinds. Jane's case report was spread out on the table, with a signed copy of Game of Shadows pressed down by a stack of photos. Lucio's severed finger identification certificate, Isabella's Research Institute work permit, and Manuel's experimental log. She turned on her computer and created a new document. The cursor on the title bar flickered, and she typed, "I'm not the author, I'm just." The sound of the keyboard was particularly clear in the empty office. When the last word fell, the siren of an ambulance was heard outside the window. The long tail sound was wrapped in the wind and poured into the window, blowing the pages of the case report on the table. Jane closed her computer and put all the information into the evidence box. When the lock clicked, she caught a glimpse of half a page of Havel's manuscript at the bottom of the box, with the wet ink handwriting flickering in the shadows. The real ending is always after the reader closes the book. She picked up her suitcase and walked towards the elevator, the sound of her high heels hitting the wall like some unfinished Morse code. Jane's pen tip poked at the last page of the case report, and the ink dripped out in a small ball. She took out a tissue and pressed it, leaving behind the words Research Institute. This was the keyword she had written for the 7th time. The printer hummed in the police station at 3 in the morning. She put the 13 photos of evidence, 5 interrogation records, and copies of Manuel's experimental log into a brown paper bag. On top of that, she put a handwritten letter with dents left by pen scratches on the letter paper. This is not about solving the case, it's about stopping a bigger experiment. The fluorescent lights in the detention center were so bright that it was hard to open your eyes. Isabella's handcuffs hit the iron table with a clanking sound. "You know what?" She suddenly smiled, and the arc of her mouth was exactly the same as the sneer of Dark Knight Rose in Javier's manuscript. Javier wrote in his diary that the most successful ending is that no one knows how it started. Jane's fingers gripped the back of the chair. Isabella pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her sleeve and pushed it through the bars. The edges of the note were charred, as if it had been snatched from a fire scene. On it was Javier's handwriting, with the ink half smudged. The story is over, but the next one is waiting for you. Click. The lock of the interrogation room was unscrewed. As Jane stood up, holding the note, her cell phone vibrated in her pocket. Irene's caller ID jumped glaringly. The coffee in the publishing house's tea room has gone cold. Irene slapped a contract on the table, with the cover printed with bloody end interactive novel adaptation authorization. He signed it last month. She tugged at her collar, designating you as a reality consultant, saying only readers can define the direction of the story. Jane dug her nails into her palms. The signature on the last page of the contract was Javier's, exactly the same as the signature in her book. Even the arc of the pen stroke was exactly the same. I refuse. She pushed the contract back. You shouldn't have written me into the story. When she was leaving the publishing house, the front desk clerk called her and said, "There's a package for you." It was neatly wrapped in brown paper and had no sender's address. The moment Jane tore it open, a blank notebook fell out, with the words dedicated to future authors written in gold paint on the title page. She turned to the first page and held the pen tip in the air for 3 seconds. I will not be your ending. As the ink fell, a car horn sounded outside the window, which sounded very much like the sound of an ambulance late that night. The window of Javier's study was open. Jane walked across the familiar oak floor, where chalk circles remained where her muddy boots had left their marks. She took out the silver rose badge from the evidence bag. The bronze rose at the scene had been melted by Lucio, but the silver rose in Javier's manuscript should return to where it belonged. When putting it back on the windowsill, the metal hit the wood with a slight sound that raised a cloud of dust. She closed the computer on her desk, and the screen lit up for one last moment. It showed the title of Javier's unfinished document, Bloody Finale. The moment the lights went out, the wind blew the curtains over and swept across the back of her hand. It was like someone gently touched her fingertips. Jane's eyes swept across the desk as she retreated to the door. The blank notebook had been lying there for some reason, its cover glowing faintly in the darkness. She squinted her eyes. A new line of words appeared between the pages of the last page, as if written in invisible ink slowly appearing in the moonlight. The next chapter begins with you. Jane's hands shook as she inserted the key into the lock of the apartment door. She placed the notebook on the bedside table and rubbed the hard cover repeatedly with her fingertips. The computer beeped in the living room, and the blue standby light cast a shadow on the wall. She walked over and pressed the power button. The moment the screen lit up, an unread email popped up on the desktop. Sender, anonymous. The subject line has only one word. Start. Jane's fingers paused on the notebook cover. For 3 seconds, she turned and walked towards the living room, the dim blue light from the computer screen stinging her eyes. The moment the power button was pressed, a scanned copy of the first chapter of Bloody Finale automatically popped up. She had copied it from the evidence room 3 days ago. The mouse hovered over the title Death of Silver Rose, and she suddenly narrowed her eyes. The edge of the tailhook of the letter R is rough, as if it had been soaked in water and then blown dry urgently. She leaned closer to the screen, fingertips pressed to her temple. The manuscript was handwritten by Javier with a fountain pen. He was used to using an ostrich feather pen, and the ink was so thick that it seeped into the back of the paper, so it was impossible for this kind of blur to appear. She nearly knocked over her cup when her phone vibrated in her palm. Fernando's voice came out from the receiver. Jane, the spectrometer in the laboratory has been repaired. The scanned copy of the manuscript you mentioned, sending it to you now. She quickly tapped the send button. Pay special attention to the edges of the letters. There may be hidden ink. The laboratory at 2 o'clock in the morning was filled with cold white light. Fernando pushed up his glasses, and the spot of ultraviolet light moved across the scanning board. Jane stared at the monitor screen, her heartbeat drowning out the hum of the equipment. Here, Fernando's tweezers touched the lower right corner of the word mark and neck marks. It reacts in infrared mode. A line of crooked small words appeared on the screen, like a piece of paper that had been deliberately crumpled and then smoothed out. This is not a novel. This is an invitation. Jane's nails dug into her palms. He knew, she whispered. He knew he would be killed. So he hid these. Fernando's Adam's apple moved. Do you need me to check the source of the ink? Block the coordinates first. She grabbed her coat. I'll go to the study. The door to Javier's study clicked shut behind him. Jane took out the silver rose badge from the evidence bag. The copper rose at the scene had been melted, but Javier specifically asked his assistant to keep a replica of the silver rose in the manuscript. I need tools. Juan's voice came from the door, holding a miniature welding gun. The petals of the metal rose are snaps. I fixed them last week. Jane took a half step back. When Juan unscrewed the third petal, the sound of metal friction was so piercing that it made people's ears ring. There's something. He used tweezers to pick up a metal tube the size of a grain of rice. Film old-fashioned. The moment the projector lit up, Javier's voice exploded in the noise. Manuel, reality must be an extension of fiction, but this is murder. Another male voice trembled. No, it's an experiment. Javier chuckled. When the reader becomes a character, when the murderer acts according to the script, the story comes alive. Jane's phone vibrated in her pocket. Her hands shook when Lola's name popped up.
I'm sorting out his consultation records. Lola's voice was very low. There's a blue-covered notebook stuck in the crack of the sofa.
When the photo came, Jane almost dropped her phone. On the yellowed pages, the pen words are so powerful that they can be seen through the paper. When the reader becomes a character, the story comes to life. Jane Elliott would come here and she would be the key. The night wind blew in through the window, making the film rustle on the table. Jane looked out the window at the sea of neon lights. Lucio's face, Irene's contract, and the words on the notebook overlapped in front of her eyes. She suddenly remembered that 3 days ago at the publishing house, Irene said Javier signed an interactive novel authorization agreement and appointed her as a reality consultant. Thinking back to when Lucio was arrested, he sneered. Do you think he's really writing a novel? He's writing about us. Jane said to the air, her voice as light as a sigh. Lucio is the villain. I'm the detective. Irene is the insider. Even you, Lola, and Juan are characters in his writing. The phone beeped. The title of Fernando's email was Spectral Analysis Report Full. Her hands were shaking as she clicked on the attachment. In the first page of data, the coordinates of the hidden text were connected into a string of numbers, and the last 3 characters were glowing faintly on the screen. Next chapter. Chapter 22. The mirror does not reflect people, but the shadow in your heart. Jane's fingernails left a crescent mark on the edge of the phone. It took 17 seconds for Fernando's email attachment to load. She counted the seconds, and every tick felt like a tap on her temple. When the first line of data popped up, her pupils shrank to the size of pinpoints. Behavior prediction model. Jane Elliott. Pulling down, the scroll bar brings out a long string of codes. She ordered an iced American coffee at the cafe last Wednesday and spilled half of the cup because her hands were shaking from staying up late, looking at the scene photos. She deliberately threw the evidence bag on the table, interrogating Mark in order to observe the tremor of his pupils. Even the number of times she adjusted the position of her police badge in front of the mirror before going out this morning were all accurately recorded as ritualized confirmation action. Frequency 3 times. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck, and Javier's signature on the phone case was blurred by the sweat from her palm. detective. The sound exploded from behind. Jane turned around suddenly and saw Isabella standing outside the glass of the interrogation room. This assistant who always keeps his eyes down while organizing documents now has an abnormally red nose and his knuckles are white from being pinched. The door of the interrogation room locked with a click. Isabella suddenly laughed, her laughter sounding like rusty gears. "Do you think you're solving a case?" She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her sleeve. "He made me wait for you until this point." The edge of the note was stained with coffee, and the handwriting was Javier's cursive. If she reads this, it means she already believes that she is free. Jane's temple was throbbing. She recalled the authorization letter for the interactive novel that Irene handed to her at the publishing house 3 days ago. Javier had written in his own handwriting, "Reality consultant, Jane Elliott." At that time she thought it was a benefit for book fans, but now it seems that every word is like a noose around her neck. "Irene's office," she yelled into the intercom. "Get me the original correspondence from Javier and the Institute right now." The filing cabinets at the publishing house were covered with a thin layer of dust. Irene stood at the door, twisting her silk scarf, unconsciously. "He said these were private communications." "Open it." Jane's voice was as cold as a knife. Yellowed letter paper floated out from the brown paper bag at the bottom. The corners of the last page of the letter had been folded repeatedly, and the words written in pen were soaked with ink. "I write to you so that you can write to me." Jane's breath hitched. She remembered Lucio's sneer when he was arrested. "Do you think he is really writing a novel?" She remembered what Javier said in the film. When the reader becomes the character, the story comes alive. It turns out that it wasn't Javier who was setting them up, but someone was setting up Javier, and he was using her hand to resist. The research institute at midnight is like a dead city. Jane moved along the wall. The route of the surveillance blind spot was marked by Fernando, who hacked into the security system. She took out the master key she had taken from the evidence room, and when she inserted the third key into the keyhole of the underground archive room, the metal made a slight click sound. The labels on the filing cabinet glowed coldly in the light of the cell phone's flashlight. When she turned to the 17th carton, a hardcover file fell at her feet. The words "Narrative Mirror Project" on the cover made her blood freeze instantly.
Through the novel text, behavioral anchors are implanted to guide the target individuals to complete the preset trajectory.
Subject A, Javier Romero, using his creative desire to transform his resistance into narrative power. Subject B, Jane Elliott, set up the identity of book-loving detective and strengthen the behavior pattern of seeking the truth through the chain of clues. The paper rustled under his fingertips. She heard her own heartbeat like a drum, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It turned out that every detail at the scene of Javier's death, and every decision she made when investigating the case, were written lines. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Jane stared at the strange number, and suddenly remembered the words "next chapter" in the film. She pressed the answer button, and a vague male voice came from the noise of electricity. "Are you still reading?" Snap. She smashed her phone into the trash can in the corridor, and the sound of shattering glass echoed in the empty hallway. Moonlight leaked in through the air. Venton shone on the document she was holding tightly, revealing the words "Narrative Mirror Project" with sharp edges. She took out her cell phone and quickly dialed 3 numbers. Irene's phone rang first. Just as she said hello with a sleepy tone, Jane interrupted her and said, "Come to my house before dawn." Lola's voice was nasal. "What happened?" "Bring all of Chihaver's unpublished consultation records." Finally, it was Fernando's turn. The sound of keyboard tapping came from the receiver. I hacked into the Institute's server and found that's enough. Jane looked at the gradually brightening sky outside the window, stroking the edge of the document with her fingertips. "This time we will write our own ending." At 4 o'clock in the morning, Madrid was still shrouded in darkness. Jane stood on the second floor of an abandoned cafe in the old town. wiping the dusty projector lens with her sleeve. When Irene burst the door open holding a brown paper bag, she was dragging the final draft epilogue document into the projection software. "Is this place safe?" Irene's high heels tapped on the broken wooden floor. "I went around 3 streets before I got rid of the black car that was following me." Jane didn't look back, her eyes fixed on the loading bar jumping on the screen. Fernando hacked into the municipal surveillance system. This place was just designated as a demolition area 3 days ago, and even the electronic eyes were removed. Lola then walked in, with a tightly sealed file box under her arm, and the ends of her hair were still wet with morning dew. "Here are the records of Javier's last 5 consultations. He said last week, 'Someone is writing the storyboard for me.' I thought it was creative anxiety, not anxiety." Jane pressed the projection button. The pale blue light covered the walls. The first page of the document had her name on it. Below the bolded prediction of Subject B's behavior trajectory. Every step from Javier's death scene to last night's infiltration into the Institute was listed. What time she entered the evidence room, which key she used to open the archive room, and even the force with which she smashed the phone was marked with error. Irene dug her fingers into her palms. So it's no coincidence that the murderer copied the manuscript. It was them. They made Lucio a puppet, and Javier's novel a script. Jane used a laser pointer to point to the decision node 17. It predicted that I would apply for a search warrant before 6 this morning. But she turned to Fernando, who was connecting a laptop to the projector. "We changed our plans." The screen switched to another interface, and Fernando's fingers quickly tapped on the keyboard. "When I hacked into their server, I found that all the predictions were based on your past behavior data. Jane's case-solving habits, Irene's email sending time, Lola's medical records." He called up a heat map. "The solution is simple. Do the opposite." Jane took over the conversation. "Predict that I will go directly to Manuel?" "No. I am going to the National Library now." She grabbed her coat from the back of the chair. "Fernando, stay here to upload the data. Irene will check the projected documents for omissions. Lola," she looked at the psychiatrist, "if I don't contact you in 2 hours, send Javier's consultation records to the Madrid Post." Lola held her wrist. "Are you sure you want to confront him head-on? That old man has a deep foundation in the cultural world. He thinks I'm a reader." Jane's voice turned cold. "But readers close the book when they reach the end, and I'm the one who turns the pages." The marble steps of the National Library glow with a cold light. When Jane showed her ID in front of the security booth, Manuel was standing in the corridor on the 2nd floor looking down. His eyes behind his gold-rimmed glasses were like he was examining a page of an old book waiting to be annotated. "Detective Elliot." His voice was drawn out like an old scholar. "What are you looking for so early in the morning?" A parchment scroll from the 15th century. Jane slapped the narrative mirror project on the marble in the foreground. "Check who is writing my life." Manuel's fingers paused. He bent down to pick up the document. The gold-plated font on the cover was particularly dazzling in the morning light. "Where did you get it?" "From the archive room you have locked for 17 years. Jane took a half-step forward. Experimental A's resistance consciousness. Experimental B's behavior pattern. Javier had discovered it a long time ago, so he buried clues in the novel and made me his rewriter. She tapped the document with her knuckles. "But you didn't expect that what he wrote was not a story, but a script of resistance." Manuel suddenly laughed. "Do you think that making these public can break the closed loop? Do you know why I chose you?" He pushed his glasses. "Because you are the one who is best at reading. Readers always think they are in control of the progress bar. But in fact, that's enough." Jane interrupted him, took out a USB flash drive from her bag and slapped it on the file. "Fernando has uploaded the data to the dark web. 20 media outlets around the world will receive copies in 3 hours. You want me to become a work of art? She took 2 steps back, the sun shining on her shoulders through the stained glass. But I want everyone to know who the author is. As Jane left the library, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a text from Fernando. Data uploaded, fake statement released simultaneously. They may fight back, but the period was followed by an emoji of a person holding a torch. When she turned into the cafe at the corner of the alley, Irene was waiting under a parasol, holding an unopened waxed letter in her hand. Javier sent it to the publisher 2 weeks ago. Irene handed over the letter. The wax seal was a faded silver rose. He said, "If she doesn't write, just keep reading." Jane opened the letter. There was only one line of words in the center of the letter, written in Havel's signature cursive. When the reader picks up the pen, the story really begins. The cafe clock struck 10. When Jane walked into the police station, the girl at the front desk ran over holding the case report. "Detective Elliot, the higher-ups said that the Lucio case is closed. It was a personal revenge." "Got it." She took the report and glanced at it. The forged official seal still had the smell of fresh ink. I pushed open the office door and saw someone had placed a silver rose on the windowsill. The metal petals swayed gently in the wind. She opened the drawer and put Javier's blank notebook inside. He gave it as a gift at a book signing event, and on the title page it said, "To future authors." When closing the drawer, my fingertips touched a piece of paper. It was slipped in by Lola this morning, with the handwriting scribbled. "He wrote about you so that you can write about yourself." The sun shone on the table, illuminating the patterns of the silver rose. Jane turned off her computer, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. There was a faint sound of papers turning behind me, as if someone was flipping through a freshly written book. She pushed open the door, and the wind blew newspaper pages through the corridor. The headline on the front page was particularly eye-catching. "Is there another hidden story behind the death of a famous writer?" The mysterious narrative plan surfaces. The elevator door opened in front of her. Jane walked in and pressed the button for the first floor. The moment the metal door slowly closed, she heard a voice inside her heart saying, "This time, it's my turn to turn the page." That's the end of tonight's story. Thank you for listening. Have a good sleep. Good night, dear wanderer.